The Mythology of All Races, Volume 2, Edic. Chapter 25, Swan Maidens. The worldwide myth of the Swan Maidens has its place in Scandinavian mythology. The main features of the myth are that the hero of the tale sees birds, swans, geese, or ducks, flying to a lake, where, doffing their feathered dresses or wings, they become beautiful maidens, usually of a supernatural kind. Stealing up to their dresses, he takes one of them, and its owner is now in his power and becomes his wife. But long after, because she regains her dress or because her husband breaks a taboo concerning her, she flies away. The story is sometimes told of a dog, seal, or wolf, or the captured woman has scarce a trace of the animal. There are also stories in which merely part of a woman's clothing is captured and there is no shape-shifting, and in these there seems to lie the key to the whole group, the idea that for one person to gain possession of an article of clothing, ornament, hair, or nail clippings, or even to learn the secret name of another person, brings that person within his power. Any such thing contains the power of its owner, or is so much a part of him that whatever is done to it is done to him. To gain possession of it is to have its owner at one's mercy. With the weakening of such beliefs, the story would be told of supernatural women only, and it was now influenced by stories of the totemistic beast marriage group, in which a wife is both animal and human, and can take human form at will. When the incidents of this last group of tales were retracted into the group which told of a woman captured because a man gained possession of a garment or the like, the totemistic origin of the beast marriage stories had been long forgotten. But the animal skin now took the place of the garment. Two story groups thus coalesced as neatly as do the animal and human natures in the Swan Maiden. The widespread occurrence of the swan in these stories may be due to its grace and beauty, but its popularity in Scandinavian story may also be traced to the fact that the wild swan is so well known there. The deities of the Eddas could assume bird form through donning a feathered dress, fjapurhamur, cognates of which word are found in other Teutonic languages. The Swan Maiden story forms part of Volundarkvita, the tale of Volund, or Welland the Smith, which reached Scandinavia from Saxon regions. It is told first in a prose introduction, and then in the poem itself. Volund, Slagfid, and Egil were sons of a king of the Finns. They hunted wild beasts and went on snowshoes. At Ulfadlir, where was a lake, Ulfasjar, they built themselves a house. One morning they found on the shore of the lake 3 women spinning flax. Near them were the swan dresses, Aptar Hamir, for they were Valkyries. 2 of them were daughters of King Lodver, Ladgud the Swan White, and Hervor the All-Wise. The third was Olrun, Kjar's daughter from Valland. The brothers took them to their dwelling. Egil had Olrun, Slagfid took Swan White, and Volund took All-Wise. For 7 winters they dwelt there, and then the women flew off to find battles, and came back no more. 2 of the brothers set out to seek them, but Volund remained behind. Nothing is said of the heroes gaining possession of the maidens through their swan dresses, but this must have been part of the original story. Nor do we hear that the maidens recaptured them, but as they flew away, they must have done so. The poem which now goes on to tell this part of the story is fragmentary and confused. The 3 sisters are said to fly from the south through Mirkwood, following their fate. They rest by the shore, these southern maids, and spin flax. Then follow their names, and it is said of Swan White that she wore swan feathers, Svan fjaprar. The account of their capture is lost, but the next lines tell how they threw their arms round the necks of the heroes. In the 8th winter they yearned for Mirkwood. The heroes returned from hunting to find them gone, and sought them everywhere. A German version of the story, whether derived from the original Saxon tale is unknown, occurs in a 14th century poem. Wayland, or Volund, was searching for Engelburga when he saw 3 maidens bathing in a fountain, their dove's feather dressing lying near. They had flown thither, and on touching the ground had become maidens. By means of a magic root which made him invisible, Wayland was able to gain the dresses. The maidens wept, but he insisted that one should marry him ere he gave them back. This was agreed to, and Wayland chose that one of the 3 who proved to be Engelburga, long loved by him, but never seen till then. The theft of swan dresses forms an incident in Helreid Brunhildr. Brunhild, who moves on her seat like a swan on the wave, and her 7 companions had hid their swan dresses beneath an oak. There the king, Agnar, found them, and they were forced to do him service. Brunhild and her companions and the swan maidens of the Volund story are Valkyries. So also is Kara, who appears in the form of a swan. The swan maidens of Volundarkvita long to return to the wood, Mirkwood. Their names, Ludgud and Hervor, are explained philologically as indicating connection with armies and war. They fly away to find battles. They thus resemble the Valkyrie wood maidens in Saxo's story, and have obvious Valkyrie traits. The Valkyrie Kara hovered as a swan over her beloved hero Helgi in battle. By magic charms she blunted the weapons of his opponents. In his fight with Romund, Helgi swung his sword so high in the air that it cut off one of her feet. She fell to the ground and was no longer able to protect him, so he was slain by Romund. This curious mingling of Valkyries and swan maidens may have arisen from traits which they possessed in common. Flying through the air, though by different methods, knowledge of the future, links with an earthly hero. But in other respects they are quite distinct. While imagination dowered Valkyries with properties of swan maidens, the true swan maidens was never a Valkyrie. The swan maidens of universal folk story are usually of supernatural character, and perhaps they represent most closely water spirits, who would take the form of birds floating on the water. Such seems to be the nature of the 3 wise water women, Weisen Mirwaver, of the Nibelungen Lied, whose garments Hagen took, thus getting him into his power and compelling them to prophesy. One said he would have great honor, thus inducing him to return their garments. Another then said that the first had deceived him. The poem does not say that their dresses were of feathers, but they are described as wonderful, and the women are said to swim as birds upon the flood. In this episode there is no love motive, nor does it occur in a story told by Saxo. Fridleif, king of Denmark, heard an unusual sound in the air and saw 3 swans flying and calling above him. They told how Hythin was rowing on the sea, while his surf drank out of gold. Better than Hythin's was the state of the surf. Then they dropped a belt on which was writing by which their song was interpreted. Hythin, or rather his son, the text is confused, had been captured by a giant, the surf, and forced to row his boat. Fridleif must rescue him, and now he sets out to do this. These birds are swan maidens, urging Fridleif to a heroic deed. In German medieval romance and in tales current from Iceland to South Germany, the swan maiden appears. A medieval tale with many variants tells of a knight who saw a maiden bathing in a forest lake. He took a gold chain which she had laid aside, and now she could not fly away. Because of the chain or necklace, such women were called Wunschelweibere. She became his wife and bore him 7 sons, each with a necklace by which they could become swans. An old Swedish tale relates that a knight captured the swan garment of a maiden and married her. Many years after she regained it and flew away, though she had borne him several children. A more recent Swedish story has a hunter for a hero. He saw 3 swans flying to a lake where, doffing their sundresses, they became beautiful girls. Their robes appeared like linen. Advised by his foster mother, he took the dress of the youngest and most beautiful, and so gained her as wife. 7 years later he showed her the dress and told her the story. She took it, and that instant became a swan and flew away. The 7 years recall the same period in the Volund story. It occurs often in fairy tales, especially in those where a mortal is in the power of elfins and escapes at the end of that time. The swan is often a prophetic bird in Germanic and other folk belief, just as the swan maidens also sometimes foretell the future. In Eddic cosmogony, 2 swans are fed in Urd's well, the well of the Norns, and from them comes the race of swans. Whether this has any connection with the swan maiden myth or with Norns as swan maidens is unknown. The story of the Knight of the Swan had many variants, mainly Germanic. Vincent of Beauvais gives an early version in which a skiff drawn by a swan attached to it by a silver chain was seen on the Rhine at Cologne. From it a knight leaped ashore, and then swan and skiff disappeared. Long after, when the knight had married and had many children, the swan returned with the boat. The knight leaped into it and was seen no more. His descendants were living in Vincent's day. In other versions, the knight is ancestor of Godfrey of Bouillon or of other noble persons, and is also identified with Lohengrin, son of Percival, the tale thus being linked to Arthurian romance. The swan knight who comes and goes so mysteriously is a denizen of the other world, and his disappearance was the result of his wife's asking his name or whence he had come. Grimm tried to connect this romance, of which still earlier forms must have existed, with the Danish hero ancestor Skirf or his father Skild, who, as a child, was conveyed in a boat to the land which he was to aid and rule, sleeping on a sheaf of corn. Hence the name Skirf, with weapons and treasure. At his death, his body was put in the boat which then disappeared as it had come. There is, however, no swan in the legend of this culture hero. The origin of the Knight of the Swan is explained in later forms of the romance by connecting him with the story of the swan children. 7 children were born at a birth to the wife of a king, each with a silver chain round his neck. Through the enmity of the king's mother they were exposed, but a hermit saved them. She then sent men to slay them, but they contented themselves with taking the chains, and now the children became swans. One of them, Helias, was absent, and became protector of the swans, eventually regaining their chains when they assumed human form. One of them, however, had to remain a swan, for his chain had been melted to form a goblet. This swan later drew the skiff of Helias, the Knight of the Swan. This story existed separately before it was joined to the Swan Knight tale in the 12th century, and in some versions of it, the sister, not one of the brothers, is guardian of the others. One of the earliest versions is told by the monk Johannes in his Dolopathos, circa 1190 AD. Here, the mother of the swan children is called a nympha, and was probably a water elfin. Chapter 26. Dwarves. The Teutonic forms of the English word dwarf are dwerger, dwarger, dweorg, twerg, dweor. These can be traced back for at least 12 centuries, showing that the belief in dwarves must have been held by the undivided Teutons. The word may be connected etymologically with the idea of hurting or oppressing, as by the nightmare spirit, or with that of deceiving or hurting through deception, a root meaning akin to that of the various forms of the word elf. Eddic cosmogony tells of the origin of the dwarves. A later addition to Voluspa shows the gods in council. Who would shape the dwarf race from Brimir's blood and the bones of Blaine? Motsognir, mightiest of dwarves, was created. Then Durin. At Durin's command, the dwarves made many figures of human form, in and or out of the earth. Then follows a catalogue of dwarves' names. Brimir and Blaine may be names of Ymir, from whose flesh and blood earth and sea were made. The phrase figures of human form does not make quite clear whether these were men created by dwarves, or more likely, dwarves created in human form by the chief dwarves. Snorri quotes these stanzas, but gives his own prose version. The gods sitting in council recalled that the dwarves had quickened in the mould and underneath the earth, as maggots in flesh. They had received shape and life in Ymir's flesh, but now, by the gods' decree, they had human understanding and form. They dwell in the earth and in stones. Snorri had already told how the gods placed under each corner of the overreaching heaven a dwarf. Austre, or east, Vestre, or west, Nordre, or north, and Sudre, or south, names which appear in the Voluspa catalogue. Heaven is therefore called task or burden of the dwarves, or helmet of Austre, etc. With this Eddic account of the origin of the dwarves may be compared that, in the German, Heldenbuch. God made dwarves for the cultivation of wastelands and mountains, and made them artful and wise to know good and evil and the uses of all things. They erected splendid hollow hills. Giants were created to kill wild beasts and dragons, and so to give security to the dwarves. Heroes were also created for their aid. This must be based on some older pagan myth. Of some of the dwarves, Voluspa says that they went from stone dwellings through moist fields to sand fields, a poetic account of a dwarf migration or of their power over various parts of nature, rocks, earth, and moisture. Snorri quotes the passage, and then divides dwarves into those dwelling in mould and in stones, and those who proceed from Svarin's Mound to Arvangur or Joruplain. There is no doubt that the dwelling of dwarves is underground, within hills and rocks. Some of the Norns are said to be daughters of the dwarf Dwalin. Dwalin is a representative dwarf, since other dwarves are Dwalin's host. The son is called by dwarves Dwalin's deceiver, and Dwalin gave magic runes to the dwarves. The dwarf Theodrori, otherwise unknown, sang before Delling's doors a magic song which gives strength to gods, ability to elves, and wisdom to Odin. Other dwarves are named as doing certain deeds or are otherwise singled out for notice. There are the 9 who, with Loki, built Menglod's palace. Dain and Nabe made the boar Hildesvini for Freya. Lit was kicked by Thor into Baldur's pyre. Fjalar and Galar slew Kvasir and thus obtained the mead of poetry. Alvis, all-knowing, is prominent in Alvismal. The dwarf Sindri's race possess a hall of gold in Nidafell, according to Voluspa. This is apparently in Hell, and near it is the giant Brimir's beer hall. The verse is a later interpolation. Snorri calls the hall itself Sindri, and makes it a future abode of righteous men. Other dwarves are named in myths cited in this chapter. As we have seen, the Eddic dwarves are hardly to be distinguished from the Dukkalfar and Svartalfar, although Odin's Raven Song mentions dwarves and Dukkalfar separately. Certain dwarves' names show a connection with the elves. Alf, Gandalf, Vindalf, while Dain is a name shared by both a dwarf and an elf. Alberich, Alb is elf, was a king of dwarves, and Volund, skilled in that smith work for which dwarves were famous, and himself taught it by a dwarf, was yet a prince and lord of elves. Grimm, who identifies dwarves and Svartalfar, points to Pomeranian folklore which divided dwarves into white, brown, and black, according to their dress. Dwarves were skilled in smithwork, and their work was often of a magical kind. Loki, having cut off Sif's hair, and threatened by vengeance by Thor, swore to get the Svartalfar to make hair of gold for Sif. He therefore went to the dwarves called Ivaldi's sons, and they made the hair, as well as the ship Skidbladnir and Odin's spear Gungnir. Loki wagered his head with the dwarf Brok that his brother Sindri would not make 3 equally precious things. Sindri bade Brok blow the billows and not cease till the work was done. Loki, transformed into a fly, stung Brok 3 times in hope of making him stop blowing, but he could not hinder the precious things from being forged. These were a bear with golden bristles, the ring Draupnir, and a hammer. Sindri sent Brok to Asgard to claim the wager. Loki presented the spear to Odin, the gold hair to Thor, and the ship to Frey. Brok also presented his gifts, the ring to Odin, the bow to Frey, and the hammer to Thor, telling the magical virtues of each. The gods sat in judgment on the gifts, and the decision of Odin, Thor, and Frey was to be final. They decided that the hammer was best of all, the sure defense against the frost giants, and that the dwarf had won the wager. Loki offered to redeem his head, but Brok would not hear of this. "Take me," cried Loki, but Brok could not, for Loki wore the shoes with which he went through air and over water. Brok asked Thor to catch him, and he did so. Loki told Brok that he might have had the head, but not the neck. The dwarf took a thong and a knife, and would have bored a hole in Loki's lips and stitched up his mouth, but the knife would not cut. Then Brok wished for his brother's owl, and at once it was in his hand and pierced the lips. He stitched the lips together, but Loki ripped out the thong, called Vartari. So the story ends, and apparently we are to understand that Loki outdid Brok by his cunning. The dwarves, as skillful artificers, were thus necessary to the gods for some of their most cherished possessions. Reginn, fosterer of Sigurd, was a dwarf in nature, wise, fierce, and clever at magic. He became King Hjalprek's smith and taught Sigurd, making for him the sword Gram. It was so sharp that when he thrust it into the Rhine and let a strand of wool float against it, the strand was cut in 2. With this sword Sigurd cleft Reginn's anvil, and afterwards slew Fafnir, the dragon, and Reginn himself. Hogni's sword, Dainslef, was made by dwarves, and it caused a man's death every time it was drawn. If one was only scratched by it, the wound would not heal. A dwarf forged the sword for Egil, who had lost his hand, and this sword, fastened to his elbow, was wielded by him as well as if his hand had grasped it. Volund fashioned 700 rings of gold adorned with gems, a wonderful sword, and also golden ornaments for King Nidud. When he afterwards slew the king's sons, he set their skulls in silver, and made gems of their eyes and a brooch of their teeth. The Thidrik saga tells how Velint, or Volund, was placed for instruction by his father Vadi with the smith Mimir, and then with 2 skilful dwarves who dwelt in a hill. None could forge such swords, weapons, and armour as they. Velint slew them because they desired to kill him for being cleverer than themselves, a common folk tale incident. Dwarves also made the famous Brisinga men. When forced to exercise their skill, dwarves would sometimes curse the weapon made by them so that it would bring disaster for generations after. Svaforlami, grandson of Odin, was hunting and saw 2 dwarves standing by a stone. He forced them to make him a sword which would cut iron like cloth and always bring victory to its wielder. When he returned to get the sword, the dwarfs told him that it would be the death of a man every time it was drawn, that it would be the instrument of 3 acts of villainy, and that it would cause Svaforlami's death. Svaforlami struck at the dwarfs as they fled within the rock, into which the blade sank deeply. He called the sword Turfing. It shone like a sunbeam, and it could be sheathed only when human blood was still warm upon it. In parallel stories, the sword or treasure of dwarves or supernatural beings is forced from them as a ransom for their lives. And again these bring disaster to their new owners or their successors, like the treasure which Loki took from Andvari. This treasure is prominent in the saga and the Eddic poems of the Volsungs, and the fulfilling of the curse is seen in these. In the German version, the treasure belongs to the Nibelungs, or Niflungar, who, though depicted as Burgundian kings and their people in some accounts, because these were the last possessors of the treasure, are in other versions, following an older tradition, subterranean beings, dwarves or black elves. The Nibelungs are the children of Nebel, or darkness. Siegfried, or Sigurd, acquired their hoard, a Tarnkappe, or cloak of invisibility, and the sword Balmung. Besides skill in smithwork and possession of treasure, dwarves are dowered with cunning, hidden knowledge, and supernatural power. Andvari was forced by Loki to tell what retribution will befall deceivers in the other world, that is, wading through the stream Vadgelmir. Elvis can name earth, sun, moon, etc., according to the names given them by different orders of beings. And Thor says, "In one breast I have never found so much ancient lore." The dwarves Fjolar and Galar collected the blood of Quasir, mixed honey with it, and so made the mead of poetry, or the dwarves' drink. The Eddic dwarves and those of later folklore dwell in rocks or within hills, where they pursue their craft of metal workers. Elvis is described by Thor as pale, as if he had lain with corpses, and he says that he dwells deep under the earth, his house is under a stone. Swegdir, a grandson of Frey, sought the home of the gods and of Odin. After much travelling, he came to a stead called Stone in the east of Sweden, where was a huge rock. There he saw a dwarf sitting, and was told that, to find Odin, he must enter the rock. Swegdir ran into it. The rock door closed, and he was never seen again, like many others who, in popular tales, enter concealed doors in hills into dwellings of supernatural beings. That mountains were an abode of dwarfs is shown by the Norse word for echo, dvergamal, literally, speech of dwarves, the dwarves being supposed to throw back the word spoken. Mountain tops in Sweden are sometimes called Dwergemal Kletten, Dwarf Speech Summit. In their subterranean region, as later sagas and stories shows, the dwarves have a beautiful kingdom and are ruled by kings. They come forth at night, for sunlight is fatal to them, turning them to stone, as Thor says to Elvis, "Daylight is upon thee, O dwarf, now shines the sun in the hall." The implication is that the dwarf was turned to stone, like dwarves in other stories, or the monstrous Remgerd. Hence, from dwelling underground, dwarves are pale of countenance. Nothing is said in the Eddas of the dwarf's hat or cloak of invisibility, the Tarnkappe, Tarnhut, Nebelkappe, or Hellkappe of German dwarf traditions, though it must have been known in Scandinavia as the Helid Helm and Hullidshjelm show. This garment also gave its owner great strength, and if it fell into a mortal's possession, he could compel a dwarf to do his will or relinquish his treasure. The more evil aspects of dwarves in their relations with men as shown in later belief is suggested by some of their names in the Edda. Altjolf, or mighty thief, Hletjolf, or hill thief, while in Thidrik's saga, Alfrek, or Alberic, is called the great thief. Their love for beautiful girls or women is illustrated by the desire of Alvis for Thor's daughter and the amour of the four dwarves with Freya, just as in later German heroic poems, dwarves carry off maidens into their hills. In all Teutonic lands, especially in their mountainous districts, dwarves have been a subject of popular superstition, and their traits as seen in the Eddas reappear along with many others. They are called Bjerfolk, Unterjordisk, Unterirdisch, Erdlaute, Bergsmedlein, Erdmanlein, Stille Volk, Kleine Volk, and by other names. They seem now to be unknown in Iceland, though their name survives in place names. Dvargastein, Dvarghol, etc. Dverge are still known in Norway, and the Danish Bjergfolk or Trodfolk closely resemble dwarves and dwell in mounds containing rich treasure. The Swedish Dvarg lives in the mountains with wife and daughters of rare beauty. Dwarves are also known in the Faroe Islands, and in Orkney and Shetland, the trolls or drows are akin both to dwarves and fairies, but the older belief in Dvergar is shown by such a name as the Dwarfy Stone, a huge boulder on Hoy. The dwarves of Germany have, on the whole, a wider field of operation than the Norse dwarves of the Eddas, perhaps because the older Elben are blended with them. They have skill in smithwork and teach it to men, yet the hammering and machinery of men drove them away. They spin. They help men in harvesting and haymaking. They give freely to those whom they favor, but not to those who seek them out or annoy them. Tales of dwarves abound in the mining regions. On the plains, the Unterirdisch are a kind of elven equivalent of the mountain dwarves. The dwarves have great treasures in their underground dwellings, and music sounds from these places, whence they come forth at night to avoid the sun. In them they have control over metals and work at their smithies. An older description of the dwarves' hollow hills is found in the Haldenbuch, where the dwarf king Lorin leads Dietrich and his fens into hills brighter than the sun because of their encrusted gems. They echoed with the song of birds and are full of dwarves, singing, playing, and feasting. The dwarves are like little men, sometimes no bigger than a thumb, deformed, with large heads, long beards, feet occasionally like those of a goose or goat. They are clad in grey, but their kings are more splendidly attired. These kings have large territories, and they and their subjects are often described in German medieval poetry and romance, which reflect on them, the feudalism of the time. Old tradition depicts them as leading simple lives, and the dwarf in Råd complains of human faithlessness, which, with unwholesome food, is the cause of men's brief life. Dwarfs themselves are often of great age. Something of the old heathenism clings to them. They are even called heathen, and dislike the building of churches and bell ringing, no less than they do agriculture and the clearing of forests. The smith or other work of dwarves was made available to men who laid metal to be forged or wool to be spun, with a piece of money, before their holes. Next morning the work was found done. This custom, referred to in several tales, is connected with Wayland or Volund the smith in England. At an ancient sepulchral monument at Ashbury in Berkshire, supposed to be the dwelling of Wayland, a horse requiring a shoe was left with a piece of money. When its owner returned, the horse was shod and the money was gone. This monument was already styled Welandis Mythan in a charter dating from before the Norman conquest, the tradition thus belonging to Saxon times. A similar legend was told in Greece of Hephaestus, and we may regard the story as based on early custom and enshrining the mystery and fear attracting from long past ages to metal workers. It is also connected with the widespread custom of the silent trade. The dwarves sought human help when they required it. Example, in dividing a treasure, as in an incident in the Nibelungenlied. The dwarf king Nibelung left his hoard to his sons, who asked Siegfried to divide it, giving him the sword Balmung as reward. But as he was long at his task, they attacked him, and he slew them. The folk-tale incident of a hero called in to divide magical things among disputants often describes these as dwarves. The hero is able to make himself possessor of the things in question. Or again, dwarves seek human aid in their fighting, like the dwarf king who gave William of Scherfenberg a girdle with the strength of 20 men, on condition of his aiding him and keeping silence about their pact. Other services done to German dwarves were sometimes rewarded with gifts which brought prosperity to a family as long as its representatives lived. The most usual service was that sought from human midwives, who were well rewarded for their trouble. They also gave help to mortals, example, by means of their magic power, as in the well-known story of Rumpelstiltskin, though here an equivalent was sought in return. As wise counselors, they advised men or warned them of danger, and those coveted magic articles which produce unfailing abundance are sometimes given by them to men. Frequently, dwarfs or little red men come out of a magic snuff box or appear at the blowing of a flute, or when the ground is knocked on, and perform otherwise impossible tasks for him who surmounts them. Yet they were often hostile to men, and many stories relate how dwarves, like other elfins, carry off women or girls to be their wives. They also, like fairies, substitute for mortal children stolen by them their own deformed offspring. The changeling is called Umskiptungar in Iceland, Skiftingar in Denmark, Norway, from skipta, to exchange. Wechselinga, German, Wechelbalg, Kielkropf. Dwarves also steal from men, corn and peas from the field, loaves from a baker, and the like. Less animistic than elves, the dwarves seem to be more akin to men. Does this mean that they are a folk memory of an actual race of small people? This theory has been seriously held or has been regarded as a possibility by different scholars. Dwarves were an aboriginal small race, driven to the hills by newcomers, but regarded by them with awe as being in league with the gods of the land and possessed of powerful magic. They and their deeds became more and more unreal as time passed on, until tradition made of them a supernatural folk, with greater powers and knowledge than men. We must remember, however, that dwarves and pygmies belong to universal folklore, not only to that of the Teutonic or even of the Indo-European people. Even if an actual pygmy people, as in Africa, may be regarded by their neighbors as more or less supernatural, the theory does not account for all the facts, and it is equally possible that a race of spirit beings might have been invested with traits of an actual race. The existence of pygmy races at the present time, negrillos and negritos, as well as their probably widespread existence in Neolithic times, has given support to this theory, especially when it is proved that certain characteristics of dwarves are also those of these races. If traditional dwarves are a folk memory of actual people, then the tradition must be an early one, coming down through the generations from prehistoric times. But while some traits of dwarves and of elfins generally may be traced to those of actual races of men, others are purely animistic in origin. Even where, as in Polynesia, Melanesia, or Africa, certain groups of fairy-like beings seem to be an actual race thus transmuted, many things ascribed to them are non-human. Their tiny size, the supernatural powers of glamour and invisibility, their spirit nature. With every allowance for the facts, the existence of an early pygmy race cannot be the sole cause of the belief in dwarves and elfins. The belief in the soul, as a mannequin, no less than general animism, has had great influence in its formation. What is said of dwarves and fairies is also said of groups of beings with no human ancestry. Greek nereids, Slavic villi, foxes in Japan, vampires, ghosts, etc., and many fairy-like beings. Nixies, mermaids, swan maidens have no link with an older human race. Primitive animistic or pre-animistic ideas are the basis of dwarf and fairy beliefs, attached now to groups of purely imaginary beings, now to all kinds of supernaturals, now linked with traditions of actual people. Much also must be assigned to the free working fancy of imaginative men in the past, its results quickly assimilated by their fellows. And there is much in the saying that the wish is father to the thought. Men wish to be invisible, to transform themselves, to fly, to possess magic weapons and other articles, abundant treasures, knowledge of the future. What more easy than to believe that certain beings had such powers and gifts, and that favored mortals could obtain them on certain terms, and had actually done so from time to time? Chapter 27. Giants. There are different names applied to giants in the Eddas and Sagas, as well as in German tradition. Jotun, Eoten, Jaiten, from eta, or to eat, perhaps express their gluttony, and these names are continued in the Etin of Scots folklore. Thurs, Thurs, Duris, Thuris, perhaps mean powerful, from Sanskrit turas, or strong, though the corresponding Danish tosse means simpleton. The Risi, Sanskrit ursan, or strong, appears in Bergrisi, or mountain giant. The Hyune, or German Hühne, signified in its root meaning strength and daring, or perhaps great size, but was confused with the name of the dreaded Huns. The word troll, formerly a more or less demoniac being, is now used in Scandinavian speech for giant or ogre. Female giants were called Thursameyjar, or giant maids, Gugur, and occasionally Gifur or Grither. Giants appear in the Eddic cosmogony. The first giant, Ymir or Orgelmir, existed before earth and sea were formed, and he was made from venom dropping from Elivagar, or stormy waves, into Ginnungagap. According to Snorri, this venom congealed into ice, and the ice melted in contact with warm air from Muspelheim. Life quickened in it, and Ymir was the result. He and all his descendants, the frost giants, were evil. To Odin's question, how did Ymir beget children without a giantess, Vafthrudnir replied that beneath his arms a male and female grew, and foot with foot formed a six-headed son. This son was probably Thrudgelmir, mentioned in an earlier stanza of Vafthrudnismal. His son was Bergelmir, and Vafthrudnir remembered how he was born in a boat long ago. Snorri gives the same account and says that Ymir was nourished with the milk of the cow Audhumla. When Ymir was slain, so much blood flowed from him that all the frost giants were drowned, save Belgermir, who, with his wife, escaped in a boat, or millstone. Saxo also makes the giants an ancient people, the first of three races in far-off time. The giants dwelt in Jotunheim, or in Utgard outside the limits of earth and sea, assigned to them by the gods. It is on the edge of heaven, beyond Elivagar. The river Ifing, which never freezes, separates the realms of giants and gods. This region lies in the north or northeast, or east, according to various accounts in the poems and in Snorri. It has fields with cattle, regions where hunting and fishing are carried on, and halls where the giants dwell. Saxo's giants have also herds or goats. On its frontier, on a hill, sits Egther, warder of the giants, and the cock Fjalar, whose crowing wakes them at the doom of the gods. At the end of heaven, hence probably near Jotunheim, the giant Raisvelg, or corpse eater, sits in eagle's form and makes the winds with his wings. His hill overlooks hell. Jotunheim was a mountainous region, and this, coupled with the fact that in later tradition mountains are the home of giants, explains the names Bergbui, Bergrisi, or mountain giant. But any distant region was apt to be called the home of giants and monsters. Saxo says that a wild region north of Norway and separated it by the sea was peopled with monsters, and perhaps Greenland is intended. Snorri speaks of giants, dwarves, and blue men, dragons, and wild beasts as existing in Sweden. Saxo also thought that Denmark had once been cultivated by giants, and found proof of it in megalithic remains and boulders on hilltops. The statement in Grimnismal that the frost giants dwell under one of the roofs of Yggdrasil and beside Mimir's well, according to Snorri, is due to the systematizing of Norse mythology. The giants have separate dwellings in Jotunheim. Example, Gymir, before whose horse fierce dogs were bound. Thrym is called Lord of the Giants, and has many giants under him, and Utgard Loki is Lord of Utgard. Svipdagsmal also speaks of the seat of the giant race. Hence giants lived in some kind of community. Giants are of great size and are sometimes monstrous. This is shown by Skirnir's vast glove and by other indications. They have many heads, varying from 3 to the 900 possessed by Tyr's grandmother. According to Saxo, they are shaggy, monstrous beings who can alter their shape or size. The hero Starkad, sprung from giants, had many hands. Thor tore 4 of these off, and now his giant's body was contracted and made human. Saxo records this, but discredits it. In another account, Starkad had 8 arms, but perhaps the hero is confused with a giant of the same name overcome by Thor. Giant women were sometimes beautiful and beloved by gods or heroes. The giants were of great might. Vidblindi drew whales out of the sea like little fish. Others tossed huge rocks as if they were small stones. The giantess Jurukkin could alone move Baldur's funeral ship. To giants as to dwarfs, the sun was fatal, turning them to stone. The monstrous Hrimgerd was thus transformed, and men will mock at her as a harbour mark. In one of many stories of Saint Olaf's encounters with giants, he cursed a giantess so that she became stone. Adjectives applied to giants indicate aspects of their character: haughty, insolent, dangerous, joyous, morose, fierce, hard, energetic, warlike. In later tradition, they are stupid, but in the Eddic poems they have a wisdom of their own, due to their great antiquity and early origin. Hence they are wise, sagacious, full of wisdom, as Vafthrudnir was. Suttung owned the poetic mead, and runes were given to giants by the giant Alsith, the all-wise. Giants were often insolent, violent, especially when thwarted, and their rage was called Jotunmodr, or giant frenzy. Saxo tells how a giant fell into such a frenzy, biting his shield, gulping down fiery coals, and rushing through fires. They were nevertheless often good-natured, merry as a child, like Humir in Hymiskvita. Mostly they were hostile to gods and men, and Thor was their great opponent, his hammer the great defense of the gods against the frost giants. The gods feared that the hill giants might cross Bifrost Bridge, or the Rainbow Bridge, into their abode. Hence, what was red in it was burning fire, and Heimdall was its guardian. Yet a giant rebuilt their citadel for the gods, that it might be strong against the giants. The breaking of the gods' pledges to this giant, however, leads to their attack upon them at the doom of the gods, when the frost giants come out with Loki and Rum against the Aesir. The giants sometimes outwitted the gods, as in the story of Skirmir, but more unusually, gods, especially Odin, were cleverer than giants and cheated them, just as Thor overcame them by force. Yet Odin's descent was traced from giants, and at Baldur's funeral, frost and hill giants were present. Gods also married giantesses or had amours with them: Frey, Njord, Odin, and Thor, with Grid and Jarnsaxa. Giants also sought to unite with goddesses, Thjazi and Idun, Thrym with Freya. Gefjun had 4 sons by a giant. Saxo tells several stories of giants who carried off princesses, and the giantess Hardgrep, who had nurtured Hadding, sought and obtained his love when he was grown up. The Eddic giants also stole mortal women, as Hrimgerd says her father Hati did. Hrimgerd herself desired Atli as a lover. Besides the giants who figure in the myths of Thor and Odin, others are named and described. Brimir had his beer hole in Okolnir, the not cold, presumably a volcano in the frost regions. From his blood came the dwarves, and Odin has a sword, unless Brimir is here the name of the sword itself. Hrimnir, a frost giant, has children called Heith, or witch, and Rostjof, or horse thief. Skirnir told Gerd that Rimnir would stand and stare at her fate if she refused Frey. Rimnir, Rimgrimnir, the frost-shrouded, dwells by the door of hell, and Gerd was threatened with him as a possessor. Helgi told the monstrous Rimgerd that she would be mistress of the giant Lothin, who dwelt in Tholi, or Pine Island. This very wise giant was yet worst of all dwellers in the wild. Alvaldi was father of Thiazi, Idi, and Gangur. He was rich in gold, and at his death his sons agreed to take the gold each in the same number of mouthfuls, so that all should share equally. However monstrous the giants may be, they are anthropomorphic. A few other beings called giants are theriomorphic. Example, the brood of Loki, himself called a giant and the son of a giant. The giantess Angerboda bore to him the Fenris wolf and the Midgard serpent, giant animals of a supernatural kind. The wolves Hati and Skoll, who pursued the sun and moon, are giants, offspring of the Fenris wolf and the giantess. The giant Reisvelg, who causes the winds, is in eagle form and is called the tawny eagle, who gnaws corpses at the doom of the gods. Giants also took animal form occasionally, and some of them had animal names: Hyndla, or she-dog, Kot, or cat. The hill giants were connected with hills and rocks. Suttung and Gunlod dwelt in rocks, and the rocks were called the giants' parts. Thrumheim, or home of Clamour, where Thiazi dwelt, was in the mountains. The giantess who accosted Brunhild had her home in the rocks. The titles Bergbui, Bergrisi, Bergdaner point to hills as the giants' dwelling, and some hills were regarded as petrified giants, while some names of giants suggest a connection with stone. Hrungnir had a stone head and heart, and a shield made of stone. Frost giants, or Rimthursar, are personifications of frost, snow, and ice, or of the mountains covered with snow and ice. As Ymir himself originated out of ice, so his descendants are the frost giants, who appear at the doom of the gods in a body, led by Rum. Fire giants are suggested by the dwellers in the far world, who, led by Surth, come forth to fight the gods. Surth's fire will destroy the world. Meanwhile he sits at the frontier of Muspel, the region of heat, to defend it, brandishing a flaming sword. Icelandic folklore knows that in the Surtar Hellir, a great lava cave, there once dwelt the giant Swarth, or Surth. The giantess Jurukkin has a name which means fire whirlwind. Logi in Utgard is fire which consumes everything. Aegir's servant was Eldir, or fireman, and other giants have names pointing to the same element. Eruptions were thought to be caused by giants. Some giants were connected with the wild forest regions. Vitholf, wolf of the wood, named in Yunlol-Yod, may be the Vitolfus of Saxo, skillful in leechcraft and living in the wilds. Those who sought him with flattering words to cure them he made worse, for he preferred threats to flattery. When the soldiers of Eirik menaced his visitor Halfdan, Vitolfus led them astray by a delusive mist. His name is from Vipper, or Vittu, a wood, and he resembles the wild man of the Tyrol who wades by leechcraft only when he is threatened. He is akin to the giant Vidolf in Thidrik's saga, and to the Bavarian giant Vidolt, or the Wood Lord. The Ivitjar, or the Wood Giantesses, of whom Hundla was one, and the giant Weldrish, or Lord of the Wood, belong to the same category. The Edda speak of an old forest called Earvind, or ironwood, in which lived the giantess who bore Fenrir's monstrous brood. In that wood dwelt troll women called Jarnvitjur, or ironwood women. These giants of the woods resemble the shaggy wood spirits or skrats of German folklore. Such giants resented the cutting down of timber in their domain, threatening the woodcutter with death if he persisted. There were also giants of the waters, like Grendel in Beowulf, called Eoten and Thrus, and his monstrous mother. Grendel might be a personification of the storm flood which devastates the low-lying coasts of the North Sea. As Beowulf slew the mother of Grendel in the mere, so Grettir, as is told in the Grettis saga, dived into a waterfall and entered a cave where he slew a giant who dwelled there. Both incidents are variants of a common theme. Other giants associated with the waters are Aegir and Ran. Aegir to Ran is Hreimgerd, who, with a mother, lay in wait for ships and is called corpse-hungry giantess. Possibly other elements of nature were typified in certain giants. A curious genealogy of giants shows how the forces of nature were conceived of as giants, though the genealogy itself is of comparatively late date. Fornjot, the old giant, was progenitor of the giants, the first dwellers in Norway. He was father of Kari, the wind, of Ler, Aegir, or Ymir, the sea, and of Logi, the fire. Kari had a son, Jökull, or icicle, whose son was Snær, or snow. Snær had 4 children, Snowheap, Snowdrift, Blackfrost, and Fine Snow. Some of these are euhemerized as kings in the Heimskringla and in Saxo, but the genealogy suggests an old myth of the cold north wind producing ice and snow in their different forms. Different theories have been advanced regarding the origin of the giants. They have been regarded as an earlier and wilder race of men, with stone weapons, opposed to the more cultured race which uses the plough, as in stories where a giant's daughter carries home a ploughman and his plough, and learns that he and his kind will yet do the giants harm. The wilder traits of giants suggest a savage race, but the story does not explain the universal belief in giants, nor the great stature ascribed to them. They are also regarded as an older group of gods dispossessed by newer deities and therefore hostile to them. This theory might apply to some giants, example, Thrym and Hrungnir, who are almost counterparts of Thor himself, but it cannot apply to all. No trace of a cult of giants is found in tradition, in spite of attempts to discover this. Another theory is that of Skåning, who, taking the word Jotun in its sense of devourer, considers that this group of giants, at least, the Jotuns, were originally corpse-devouring demons of the underworld, that is, Jotunheim, originally a realm of the dead. The giants may be looked upon as mainly personifications of the wilder elements and phenomena of nature, as these might be supposed to be arrayed against men and gods, whose rule and attributes were those of order and growth. Probably no one theory accounts for the archaic belief in giants, but if this one does not fit all the facts, it has the merit of fitting many of them. To this personification must be added the power of imagination, creating those strange and monstrous forms, and giving them such intense life and movement. In folk tradition, giants were favorite subjects of story. Boulders, rocks, even islands were said to have been dropped by them as they were carrying them from one place to another. To this corresponds Saxo's theory of boulders on hilltops and the Eddic myth of the rocks formed from Hrungnir's stone club. Other stories tell of the huge print of a giant's hand or fingers on rocks which he had thrown. Tradition also tells of rocks or even stone circles which were once giants turned to stone, sometimes because they opposed the preaching of Christian saints. Example, Saint Olaf. As in other parts of the world, so in Scandinavia and Germany, the remains of archaic ages, old and mysterious buildings or ruins, were ascribed to giants. The Wirselig Gewerk of the Helliand and the Enda Gework of Beowulf and other Anglo-Saxon poetry, both phrases meaning giant's work. Hence a giant is spoken of as a smipper or artificer in the wide sense, like him who rebuilt Asgard, not merely a smith. Even old weapons were sometimes said to have been made by giants, as the phrase in Beowulf shows, Eold swerd eotenesk. Older tradition made giants fight with stone clubs and shields, or with boulders flung at their enemies. Apart from Eddic myths of giantesses, Snorri gives a prose account and cites an old poem, the Grotta Song, about two giant maidens, Fenja and Menja. Their story is mingled with versions of two widespread folk tales, the magic or wishing mill and how the sea became salt, and it is also linked to the myth of Frodi and the golden age of peace. Frodi bought the two maids, huge and strong, and set them to grind the mill called Grotti, the stones of which were so large that no one could turn them, though whatsoever one asked for them would be ground by this mill. Frodi bade the giantesses grind out gold, and this they did, along with peace and happiness. Frodi allowed them no rest for longer than the time that the cuckoo was silent, or a song might be sung. So they sang the magic Grotta song, and ground out a host against Frodi. The sea king Mysing, Rjolf Kraki, came and slew Frodi, ending the celebrated Peace of Frodi. He took the mill and the giantesses, and bade them grind out salt. They ground so much that the ship on which they sailed sank, and from that day there has been a whirlpool in that place in the sea where the water falls through the hole in the millstone. So the sea became salt. In the song, Fenja and Menja tell their story. They, mighty maidens who know the future, are enthralled to Frodi and must grind. So they will sing of what they are doing, and, since Frodi is so hard, they tell how unwise he was in buying them from their strength, without inquiring about their kindred, Rungnir, Thiazi, Idi, and Ornir. These were brothers of hill giants, and of them were the maidens born. The millstone would not have come from the mountain, nor would Menja have been grinding, had her origin been inquired about. For 9 winters the sisters had been playmates beneath the earth, moving huge rocks from their places. They had rolled the stone over the giant's garth. The ground shook beneath them. They slung the mighty stone till men took it. Then in Sweden they, as Valkyries, went to fight, caused wars, casting down and setting up kings. For years this continued, and many wars did the cause. Now they are thralls, but they prophesy how they see fire and hear war tidings, and how a host is coming against Frodi. Their song becomes a magic charm by which evils are ground out for the king. So they ground in giant frenzy, until the stone was broken, and Menja told Frodi that now they would cease from grinding. This poem is of the 10th century, and references to the story occur in skaldic poetry. The whirlpool is in the Pentland Firth, and traditions of the giant maids still linger in the Orkneys. The millstone, which is not broken in the prose version, came to men through them, a stone which they had thrown, and possibly, as Boyer suggests, they were identified with the millstones which they turned, as giants often are with the natural elements which they personify. The appearance of giantesses as Valkyries is curious, In this myth, as in the story of Volund, supernatural beings held in bondage are content to work for a time, until their wild nature breaks out and causes disaster. Chapter 28. Trolls. Snorri often speaks of Thor's having gone to the east to slay trolls. The word occurs once in the poetic Edda. One of Fenrir's brood is said to be in the form of a troll. The word included giants, but also meant beings with magic power, unearthly beings, and all kinds of monsters. The giant aspect of the troll perhaps came first, then the more demoniac. The word occurs in the sagas in these different senses. Etnar saw a troll carl, or a giant, sitting on the cliffs and dangling his feet in the surf. The Grettis saga makes Grettir say that a rock troll attacked Skaggi when he himself killed him. And Thorkel's men exclaim, "Surely trolls did not take him in daylight." A troll wife came to a house by night and ate all the food stupidly left out. Then she tore and slit men asunder and threw them into the fire. Another troll wife was overcome by Grettir and killed, but men said that day dawned as they wrestled, so that she burst when Grettir cut off her arm. Now she is a rock in the likeness of a woman. This agrees with popular traditions of giant or trolls of the mountains turned to stone when surprised by the sun or at the word of a saint. To many supernatural creatures, the sun is believed in many parts of the world to be fatal. A giant slain by Grettir in a cave, as well as this troll wife, haunted a district troubled by trolls, and was himself a troll. Men could be possessed by trolls, like Thorlaf, who, however, became a Christian. One person would devote another to the trolls with the words, "Trolls take thee and thy company." This was a common Viking curse, and resembles Harbard's final words to Thor, "Get hence, where every fiendish being will have you." Egil said to Hermund in the Bandamanna saga, "Though it was prophesied that I should die of old age, the better would I be content if the trolls took thee first." With the coming of Christianity, trolls became more demoniac, representing the supernatural powers of paganism. When Olaf was introducing the faith to Norway, trolls and other evil beings tempted his men and himself. But by his prayers, they were expelled from their haunts in the mountains. On the whole, Olaf Tryggvason and the later Saint Olaf took the place of Thor as enemy of trolls and giants. Sometimes, however, Olaf would agree with a troll to build a church, as the gods agreed with the giant to rebuild Asgard. Half-trolls are spoken of in the sagas. Grettir told how one of these ruled a certain valley, the giant Thorir, who made him his protege. Halmund's song in the Grettis saga speaks of his fighting giants, rockfolk, and half-trolls. Troll women are mentioned in the Eddas, and these are sometimes giantesses, but occasionally a troll woman is a witch, and one of these hailed Bragi by night in a forest. The word is also used as the name of a Fylgja, like that one who met Hayden. This troll woman rode a wolf bridled with snakes, but giantesses, like Hyndla, Hyrrokin, also rode such steeds, and the skaldic term for a wolf was the grey horse of the giantesses. In later folk tradition, the word troll was applied to less evil beings, though in Iceland it still retains its older meaning, and trolls there are more monstrous than elfin, though not lacking elfin traits. In Norway, troll folk or tusser may be as large as men, and music is heard from their mountain abodes, to which they carry off mortal maidens. Danish legend connects its troll folk, who are akin to dwarves, with the rebel angels, who, when cast out of heaven, fell into mounds and barrows, or into the moors, these latter the elver folk. The mounds contain treasure and may be seen raised on red pillars on St. John's Eve. These trolls are small, with big heads, and are generally friendly to men, though old ballads tell of their stealing maidens and of the seductive power of their women over men. They can become invisible or transform themselves. They prophesy and confer prosperity, strength, and other gifts on men. The stories told of them resemble those told elsewhere of fairies and elfins. They dislike the ringing of church bells and any kind of noise, and this trait has suggested a reminiscence of the troll's dislike of the noisy Thor and his hammer. The Swedish dwarg, or dwarf, is akin to the trolls or mountain dwellers, though these are sometimes of giant form. Little trolls ride out with witches, or dance and feast under stones raised on pillars on Christmas night, and the troll women entice men into these when watching their dancing. The trolls of Orkney and Shetland recall the Old Norse trolls, the traditions about them being derived from Scandinavian settlers, but much influenced by Scottish fairy beliefs. They dwell in mounds, of great splendour within. They are small, clad in green, and fond of dancing by night, but, if surprised by sunrise, must remain above ground all day. On the whole, they are malicious, and are given to abducting women and children. Chapter 29. The Nightmare Spirit. Savages regard nightmare as the oppression of a demon or ghost, and the incubus or demon lover was at first the nightmare, but personified like the Greek Ephialtes and the nightmare demons of most European lands. In ancient times and in the Middle Ages, some medical inquirers regarded nightmare merely as a dream produced by congestion of blood vessels, hindrance to breathing, or some other physical cause. The popular view was quite different, and the various names for nightmare show this. Of these, the German Mahar, with its cognates in Scandinavian speech, Mara, Danish Mer, our own nightmare, and the French Kochmar are examples. In Upper Germany, Mahar has been displaced by Alp, and the words Trut, Trud, Schrattle, and others are also in use. The Schrattle or Schrat is the medieval Pelosus, a shaggy spirit. All of these were supposed to ride or press the sleeper, even to cause death. But the sleeper's feelings varied from great pain or oppression to mild or even voluptuous sensations. He might imagine himself attacked by an animal or a more or less monstrous or shaggy being, example, fawns, satyrs, or by a male or female person, all dependent on his physical state, the position of his body, the nature of his bed, the materials of his bedclothes, no less than upon his preconceived ideas aided by his dream fancies. The Mahar might even be imagined as changing into a straw, a piece of down, a vapour, if, on awaking, the sleeper found himself grasping these, or his room filled with smoke. The form of the Mahar varies, now a giant, now a dwarf, now deformed, now handsome or lovely. A beautiful elfin was sometimes supposed to enter a room by the keyhole or a knothole, and, resuming larger proportions, to attack the sleeper. If, knowing the Mahar to have entered or having taken precautions to prevent its attack, he closed the such means of egress, the Mahar was found next morning as a beautiful nude woman. She could be forced to promise never to return, or might beg to be set free. Often, however, the Mahar was in the form of an animal. It was usually the soul of a person which had left its body in order to torment a sleeper. A witch might cause her soul to act as a mahar, or it might be the soul of a woman secretly in love with the victim. Stories show that the sleeper, finding the mahar desirable, offered her love or married her. When a Norse husband asked his nightmare wife how she had entered, and she replied that she did not know, he showed her a knothole through which, now becoming small, she vanished. This corresponds to the broken conditions by which a man loses his fairy or swan maiden wife, of whom the nightmare is the equivalent. Or she might beg the husband to remove the plug from the hole. This done, she vanished, but might return to tend her children, like the fairy wife or dead mother in other tales. A Swedish story tells how a girl, as a nightmare, tormented a man who refused her love. When he placed a scythe by his head as a means of riddance, she cried that she would die, and next morning she was found dead in bed. The mahar might be a spectre from the region of the dead, and when questioned regarding herself or whence she came, she vanished. When such a spectre was drawn back to earth by a former promise of marriage, there is a resemblance to the dead lover in the Lenore ballad and its parallels. And where the mahar is a living woman, or her spirit sent forth by her, she resembles the witch or fairy who uses a man as a steed and makes him hag-ridden. Night is the usual time for the mahar's attack, but it might occur to sleepers at noon, and then the mahar is a form of the midday demon. From old Icelandic literature, the best example of an oppressive nightmare spirit is recorded in the Heimskringla. Vanland, Svegdir's son, was king of Sweden, and abode one winter with Snare, or Snow, the old, and married his daughter Drift. He left her, but promised to return. She sent for Huld the witch in order that she might draw Vanland by spells or slay him. Vanland was sleeping, and cried that a Mara was treating him. His men tried to help him. She went to his head and legs in turn, breaking his legs and smothering him, so that he died. That the belief in the Mara was seriously regarded is shown by the ecclesiastical law which ordained that a woman, proved guilty of acting as one and riding a man or his servants, must pay a money fine. If she could not pay, she was outlawed. Chapter 30. Werewolves. While transformation of themselves or others was a property common to gods, spirits, giants, and human magic wielders, there was one form of it which, found all over the world, developed into a belief which for centuries caused terror and is not now extinct among savages and in backward regions of Europe. This is the belief in lycanthropy, the power which certain persons have of becoming wolves, or, in some regions, the fiercest animal there existing: bear, tiger, leopard, hyena, etc. The basis of the superstition is the belief in transformation, but its special form is due to mental aberration, persons of diseased mind imagining that they were wolves and the like, acting as such, and preying upon other human beings. Without the belief in transformation, this form of mental aberration could not have arisen. The belief in lycanthropy was exploited by interested persons, magicians and sorcerers. It is one of the most deeply rooted of all superstitions and the most widespread. We are concerned with it only as far as it existed among the Norsemen and other members of the Teutonic race. People who would change their form by the soul's entering another body or by putting on, example, a feather dress, and so becoming a bird, was said in Norway to be Eigi ein hamir, not of one form, They were hamramr or hamhleipa, changing form. The word for werewolf, literally man-wolf, in Norse was vargulf, a wolf worse than any other kind of wolf, or varg, wolf, wolfer, wolf. Save for one reference, the Eddas do not speak of the werewolf, but there are examples of it in the Volsunga saga. A she-wolf came night after night and ate one of Volsung's sons, set in the stalks by their brother-in-law Siggeir. Their sister Signy saved the last of the brothers, Sigmund. This wolf was held to be Siggeir's mother, who had thus changed her form. Signu's son, Sinfjotli, and his uncle Sigmund came to a house in the forest where two men were asleep, spellbound skin changers. Wolf skins hung above them, and every 10th day they came out of those skins. Sigmund and Sinfjotli put on the skins, each now howling as wolves, but thinking as men. Each went his way, agreeing that they should risk the attack of 7 men, but no more. If more attacked one of them, he must howl for the other's aid. On one occasion, Sinfjotli slew 11 men without seeking help. For this, Sigmund bit him in the throat, and then carried him home and healed his wound. They now cast away the wolf skins, devoting them to the trolls, and later burned them. The belief was mingled with, and perhaps influenced by the custom of wild warriors and outlaws. Example, the berserks, wearing wolf skins or bear skins over their armor, or clothing themselves in these, while they were often victims of frenzy and acted as if they were animals. As the person who had the power of changing his form became preternaturally strong, so the berserks in their fury were very powerful, and, as was said of 2 brothers in the train of Earl Hakon of Norway, they were not of the fashion of men when wroth, but mad like dogs, and feared neither fire nor steel. The story from the Volsunga saga is referred to in the Edda, when Gudmund said to Sinfjotli, "Thou hast eaten wolf's meat, and often sucked wounds with cold mouth, and, loathsome to all men, slunk into the dens of wild beasts." Other examples are found in the sagas. The story of Howard the Holt says that of the dead Thormod that in life he was thought to have more shapes than one, and men held him ill to deal with. The Eagle saga tells of Ulf, grandfather of Eagle, that at times he would be subject to attacks at night, during which he changed his form. Hence he was called Kveldulf, or evening wolf. In the Eyrbrugga saga, Thrond was Hamramr in his heathen days, but this fell off him at his baptism. Other persons are said to have had this power of changing their form, and a Norse gloss to the Bisklaverit of Marie de France says that in earlier times many men took wolf form and dwelt in the forests. The word Hamramr does not always refer to wolf form. The Dubthach and Storwolf were mighty skin changers. They quarrelled and were seen by a second-sighted man fighting, one as a bull, the other as a bear. The bear was the stronger of the two. Next day the valley where they had fought looked as if an earthquake had occurred in it. Both men were worn out and lay in bed. In a wild tale from Rolf's saga Kraka, Bjorn was transformed into a bear by his stepmother, who shook a wolfskin glove at him. He lived as a bear and killed many of his father's sheep, but by night he was a man. Among the Anglo-Saxons, the existence of the belief is proved by the use of the word werewolf in the laws of Knut. Example, at the Council of Winchester, 1018 AD, where preachers were told to guard their flocks from the fierce devouring werewolf, that is, Satan. Gervase of Tilbury speaks of the English name werewolf and explains its meaning. He also says that at changes of the moon in England, men became wolves. In Germany, the belief is witnessed to by the Wolfhetten, the equivalent of Ulfhedin, and meaning one who puts on a wolf girdle or skin, Wolfhammer, in order to become a wolf. The oldest literary testimony to the superstition is found in a sermon of Saint Boniface, 8th century, who speaks of the belief of the Saxons in fictos lupus, obviously werewolves. Later evidence is supplied in the penitential of the Corrector, which speaks of the gift conferred by the parquet of power to change into wolf form or any other shape at will. Vulgar folly calls this creature werewolf, the German name. The connection of this power with the German parquet, equivalents of the Norse, is curious, but points to popular tradition or to the belief that the power was innate in certain men. Modern collections of Scandinavian and German folk tales contain many werewolf stories. In later medieval times, the superstition was closely connected with witchcraft, and theologians turned their attention to lycanthropy as a branch of sorcery. The power of changing the form, or of deluding the eyes of others so as to make them believe that such a change had taken place, was ascribed to diabolic agency. In Scandinavian and German belief, the change was effected by donning a wolf skin or a girdle of human skin, or by throwing these over another person. The girdle had sometimes magic signs upon it, and was held in place by a buckle with 7 catches. When the buckle was broken off, the transformation ceased. The man was a wolf or bear by night, or he assumed the animal form for 9 days, or even for 3, 7, or 9 years, the eyes alone retaining a human appearance. He howled and devoured like the actual animal. Chapter 31. Magic. The practices of divination, prophecy, and magic were common in the pagan north, but a distinction was drawn between lawful and unlawful magic. The deities wrought magic, but this was reflected upon them from human practice. Magic songs, spells, incantations, spjall, galder, ljod, were used to effect the magic act. These were also called runes, though this word betokened magic signs engraved on something and producing magic power. After being engraved, they were colored. Hence the verse in Havamal. Runes thou shalt find, and fateful signs, most powerful signs, most mighty signs, by the mighty poet Odin colored, by the high gods made, by the chief of the gods carved. The coloring was made with blood, and this increased the power of the runes. The Norse word rune was used in 2 senses. The primary meaning was a mystery or mysterious knowledge. It also signified a letter of the alphabet, such as was used before the Roman letters came into use. The unlearned, who were the majority, would regard letters as a mystery. Hence the word rune was applied to them. These runes had a magical significance besides an alphabetic value, and apparently some magical runes were not letters in the ordinary sense. In using them, besides engraving them on some object, there was a necessary ritual which gave power to them. This seems to be referred to in Havamal, where, besides cutting, interpreting, and coloring them, There are mentioned invocation, offerings, and the right method of slaughtering the victim. The runes could not be used unless one knew their meaning, and there was danger in an ignorant use of them. Runes were ascribed to the gods, and Havamal also tells how Odin came into possession of them. He wrote them for the gods, as Dain for elves, Dwalin for dwarfs, and Alsvith for giants. Another verse of Havamal shows that not only was advice given to Lodfafnir in the hall of Odin, but that their runes had been spoken and their meaning declared. Each rune had a name which represented a particular object, and, through this, good or evil magic was wrought. Hence, to produce the magical result, the magic power of each rune must be known. Examples of imparting this knowledge are given in the Edda. The Sigurdrifa taught runes to Sigurd: victory, ale, birth, wave, branch, speech, and thought runes. Victory runes are to be written on the sword hilt and other parts of the sword. The name of Tur, the name of the rune for the letter T, being uttered twice. Ale runes, by which the wife of another will not betray a man's trust, are to be written on the drinking horn and the back of the hand. The sign Naudr, the runic N, being written on the nail. Birth runes, to relieve a woman in childbirth, are to be written on the palm of the hand and on the joints, while the deceased are called on to help. Similar explanations are given regarding the other runes. The poem then tells how Odin stood on a hill with Brimir's sword, his helmet on his head. Then Mimir's head first spoke words of truth and wisdom. There follows a curious list of mythical and actual things on which runes were commanded to be written: the shield of the sun, the ear of Arvak, the hoof of Alvish, or steeds of the sun, the wheel of the car of Rungnir's slayer, Sleipnir's teeth, the straps of a sledge, the paw of a bear, Bragi's tongue, a wolf's claws, an eagle's beak, bloody wings, the end of a bridge, the reliever's hand and the healer's foot, glass, gold, amulets, in wine and beer, on favourite seats, on Gungnir's point, on Grani's breast, on the nails of the Norns, and on the beak of the night owl. Some of the actual objects on which runes in this list were to be written resemble the miscellaneous things found in Scandinavian graves: bones of a weasel, teeth of a horse, claws, vertebrae of a snake, etc. The poem continues by saying that runes thus engraved were scraped off and steeped in mead and cast far and wide. Some are with the gods, some with the elves, some with the wise Vanir, and some with men. There are beech, birth, and ale runes, and the excellent magic runes for him who knows them rightly and reads them truly. They will benefit until the gods perish. Whether all the verses describing these runes are in a true series or drawn together from various sources is not clear. The account of the objects, mythical and actual, on which they are written seems to belong to an old myth of the value of runes, telling how they had been used. The scraping of the runes into mead and casting them abroad, so that they are now with gods, etc., is mythical, but it may be based on actual practice: drinking mead into which runes had been scraped from wood or bone. Havamal also speaks of runes being with gods, elves, dwarves, etc. The enumeration of runes is preceded by a verse telling how Sigurdrifa gave Sigurd a magic drink. I bring you beer, O tree of battle, mixed with strength and powerful fame. In it are magic songs and healing strength, beneficent charms, and love runes. As Sigurdrifa taught runes to Sigurd, so in Rigstöla, Rig taught them to the first Jarl, and his son in turn learned to use them. Life runes, everlasting runes. Now he could shield warriors, dull the sword blade, and calm the seas. Odin carved and colored runes before speaking with a dead man on the gallows, and he touched Gerd with a piece of bark on which spells or runes were written, including frenzy in her. Grimshild carved runes on the cup from which Gudrun drank and by which he forgot Brunhild. Runes were carved on the cup to destroy a poisoned drink within it, as Egil cut them on the cup which Queen Gunhild gave him. At once it broke. They were also carved on the insulting pole which he set up. Saxo tells how the giantess Hardgrep cut magic runes, or Carmina, on wood and placed them under a dead man's tongue, making him speak. The list of magic songs, or Ljod, in Havamal, already cited in Chapter 4, shows the different purposes for which they were used. In Svipdagsmal, the dead Gora chants charms at her son's request, while she stands at the opening of a barrow on a stone. These charms will help him in his dangerous quest of Menglod. The first is that which Ran taught to Rind. The second will guard him by means of the bolts of Ord. The third will make dangerous rivers fall away before him. The fourth will deliver his foes into his hands. The fifth will burst all fetters. The sixth will prevent wind and wave from harming his boat. The seventh will protect him against deadly frost and cold. The eighth will protect him from the curse of a dead Christian woman, perhaps a pagan view of the potency of a Christian's curse. The ninth will give him words and wit in a word contest with a giant. These different lists in Sigurdrifamal, Havamal, and Svipdagsmal show several points of contact. All three have charms which give power of speech and wit, such as Odin gave to his favorites. All three have charms to still tempests and to give victory. Two have charms to break fetters and charms for healing. It is interesting to compare the fetter-breaking charm with the similar magic of the Idisi in the Merseburg charm. The power-giving spells of Odin in Havamal correspond to the magic ascribed to him in the Jungelinga saga, and the passage in the saga may be a paraphrase of the stanzas in the poem. Cursing spells were used, and an example of this is found in Atlamal, where Vingi pronounces a conditional one on himself. He devotes himself to giants or to the gallows if he breaks his oath. Various names were used for magic. One of these, Seidr, which, according to the Jungelinga saga, owed its origin to Freya, usually refers to harmful magic, though sometimes also protective magic. Gulveig practiced it, and so also did Odin, according to Loki. In using Seidr, a special seat was necessary, and the magician held a staff. Magic songs were sung to effect the result. The male magician was called Seidhamdr, the female Seidkona. Deadly results were ascribed to Seidr: killing others, causing tempests, creating delusions. The Seidkona, while sitting on the seat, could send her soul out of her body in another form, while her body remained on the seat. If the soul was wounded or killed, the body of the witch showed similar wounds or fell dead. This, as well as other kinds of magic, is regarded in the sagas as a natural accomplishment of the Finns or Lapps, and often a magician was one of these. But it is improbable that all Norse magic came from Finland. The Volva and Spakona prophetess and spaewife were mainly soothsayers, like the German prophetesses mentioned by Tacitus and Dio Cassius, practiced in the art of divination, though some of them used the most hurtful seidr. The Volva traveled through the land with a retinue, especially during the winter nights when spirits were abroad. She visited one house after another, where she was well received, and a meal put out for her. In Orvar Odd Saga, Heidr travelled with 15 youths and 15 maidens. The retinue sang the magic songs by which the Volva fell into a trance and learned the future. The power of the Volva was gained by sitting out for several nights. By this sitting out, Utiseta, spirits of the dead or other supernatural powers were conjured up and gave revelations to the Volva. Even when dead, the Volva could still supply hidden knowledge, when conjured up by the proper spells. Odin called up a dead Volva to inquire of her about Baldur's dreams, and possibly the utterance of the Volva in Voluspa was made to Odin by a dead seeress. The aerial flight of witches and sorcerers to a nocturnal gathering is found in widely separated regions. Only in the later Middle Ages and under theological influence was it attributed to direct diabolic agency. In pagan Scandinavia, this flight was practiced by the Tunrida, who sat on roofs or hedge enclosures of a homestead to destroy it, or rode and sported in the air, usually after shape-shifting. Tun, a hedged place, or farm. One of the charms described by Odin in Havamal was used to discomfit these house riders. A tenth I know when house riders in flight sweep through the air. I can so work that they wander bereft of their own form, unable to find their way home. The witch's soul has left her body, assuming another form, and in that, as a result of the charm, she must wander about. Other Eddic names are Murkrida and Queldrida, Dark Rider or Night Rider, both names referring to the riding about at night. Odin used much seductive craft with night riders, and in the Eidbugja saga, the following lines occur. There are many dark riders about, and often a witch lurks under a fair skin. Geirrid said this to Gunnlaug in order to keep him from going home at night. But he set out and was found senseless, bruised, and the flesh torn in lumps from his bones. Men thought that Geirrid herself had ridden him. She was summoned to the moot as a dark rider and for causing Gunnlaug's trouble. But on her oath that she was not responsible for this, the case was quashed. In Helgagvita Jorvatsonar, Atli says to the monster Rimgerd, Atli am I, ill shall I be to thee, giant women to me are hateful. Often have I been in the dripping bows, and slain the night riders. A poem by Eilif calls Thor destroyer of Conor Queldrunnar, or night-faring beings. The Zeonritten corresponds to the Tunrida. Other names are Nahatfara, Nahatfrowa, or night-traveling women. The witch ride was performed on a gandr, or staff, the gandreid. Witches, troll women, and demoniac beings also rode a wolf bridled with snakes, and the wolf was called the troll women's steed, the dusky stallion on which the night rider fareth. The distinction between spirits or demons of a dangerous kind and the night-faring witches is not clearly sustained. Examples of the witch ride and of nocturnal gatherings occur in the later sagas. Thus, In the Thorstein saga, 14th century, Thorstein overheard a youth call to his mother in her burial mound, "Mother, give me staff and gloves, for I am going to Gandraid." These were thrown out of the mound. The youth put on the gloves, rode on the staff, and went off. Thorstein now repeated the same formula, received gloves and staff, and rode after the youth to a mountain where many people sat drinking round a king and queen. Thorstein, whose staff made him invisible, took a ring and a cloth, but at the same time dropped the staff, and becoming visible, had to ride off from the throng on the youth's staff. In the Ketil saga, we learn how Ketil was awakened by a great noise in a wood, and saw a troll woman with hair waving behind her. At his question she told him that she was going to the troll thing. To it the troll king, Ofoti, Thorged, Holgatrol, and other mighty spirits were coming. An earlier glimpse of the witch gathering is seen in the Salic law of the Franks, circa 600 AD, which condemns in a fine anyone who calls another herbergium or cauldron bearer for the strie or witches. Cattle which were troubled by a disease of the spine, causing palsy, were supposed to be troll-ridden. Witches also caused disease in cattle and death. This was supposed to be done by an invisible arrow, the Heigetessen Geskot of an Anglo-Saxon charm already cited. They did harm to crops and caused tempests. In the Gisla saga, Obd Jorga went round a house with the shins, sniffed to all the points of the compass, and drew in the air. The weather changed, and there came driving sleet, floods, and snow, which caused the death of 12 people. To the witch was also ascribed the power of blunting weapons and taking away a warrior's courage. Icelandic and Norwegian laws condemn these different practices, including the use of runes and spells, and one of these laws speaks of the troll woman who, if proved guilty of riding a man or his servants, was fined 3 marks. Chapter 32. The Other World. In this chapter, we consider the different views of other-world existence entertained in the pagan North. Hell. The Norse word hell, with its cognates, Gothic halja, hellia, helle, hella, denotes the general underworld of the dead, a primitive conception of the Teutonic peoples. In Scandinavia alone is hell also personified as ruler of this underworld, but it is not always easy to differentiate person and place. Grimm thought that an early goddess of the dead gave her name to the region of the dead, but the reverse is more probably correct. The abode of hell is under one of the roots of Yggdrasil. Of Fafnir, Sigurd said that now hell would have him, and Hogni said of the 5 sons of Butli that hell has now the half. To come to hell's seat is to die. Hell has a dog, Garm, which barked at Odin when he went to consult the dead Volva. His breast is besprinkled with blood, and he howls loud before the doom of the gods. Hell has also a dust-red cock which crows and awakens her dwellers. Snorri tells how Hermod rode down to Hell to seek Baldur's release from her. Her condition could not be fulfilled because of Loki, who said, "Let Hell hold what she has." Hence Baldur is called Companion of Hell. Hell was said to be one of Loki's monstrous offspring, whom Odin cast into Niflhel or Niflheim, giving her power over 9 worlds, to apportion their dwellings to all who were sent to her, those who die of sickness or old age. She has a great abode. Her hall is sleet cold, her servant hunger, her maidservant tardy, her threshold sinking to destruction, her bed disease, her bed cover unhappiness. She is half black and half flesh colour, and with down-hanging head she looks grim and fierce. The personified hell is somewhat monstrous, but Snorri, in this account, may have borrowed traits from Christian visions of hell. Popular sayings, however, spoke of things black as hell, and Heljarsk's skin meant a complexion of a deathly hue. The personified hell in Saxo is called Persephone, who appears to Balder before his death, saying that soon she will embrace him. Soaking Frodi, when dying, heard voices calling him home to hell. A saying about the dead was, "Hell will fold thee in her arms." The curious Solar Ljóð, or Song of the Sun, with its mixture of paganism and Christianity, speaks of the maidens of hell calling to them a man about to die. The poem of Beowulf may preserve a memory of the personified hell. In describing the death of Grendel, the poem says, "There hell received him." Hell as a place is deep down in the earth, enclosed with one or more gates. Within is the hall of hell, a high house. Near the entrance is Nipahellir, or cliff cave, where Garm, best of hounds, is set to guard. Hell is sometimes called Niflhel, which suggests a misty region. Nifl meaning mist or darkness. But the description of it in Baldur's Draumar and in Snorri's account of Hermod hardly bears this out. Balder sat on a high seat. The hall had benches bright with rings and platforms decked with gold. There the dead ate and drank mead. The way to hell is the Helveg, a troublesome road, though the plural is also used, as if there were more than one. When Hermod went to rescue Balder, he rode for 9 nights through deep and dark vales to the river Gjöll, crossed by the Gjöll bridge, thatched with gold. The maidens Modgud, who guarded it, asked his name, and said that on the previous day 5 companies of dead men rode over it, yet the bridge thundered no less under him alone. Why was he, who had not the hue of dead men, riding on Hell way? Then, learning that he sought Balder, she permitted him to ride on the Hell way to the north. When Brunhild, burnt on a pyre, went in a wagon along Hell way, she passed the house of a giantess who would have stopped her. Those who descended to hell for tidings of the dead were said to perform the Hell ride. The dead might traverse Hellway on horseback, hence the custom of bearing or burning the horse with its owner. Saxo tells how when Harald's horse and chariot were burned on his pyre by Ring, he prayed that Harald might ride on the steed and reach Tartarus before those who fell with him, and that Pluto, lord of Orcus, might grant a calm abode to friend and foe. Possibly Odin and Valhall, not Hell, are here intended. The Gjöll bridge is perhaps the brig o' dread, na broader than a thread, which, in Yorkshire belief, the dead had to cross. The toilsome journey to hell was aided by the equipment buried with the dead. Example, the Hellskor, German Tottenschuh, or the Hell shoe. The custom of providing shoes for the dead existed in prehistoric Europe and continued as a general custom. When Vestine was dressed for his barrow, Thorgrim said to Gisli, "It is the custom to bind on Hellskua for folk to walk to Valhall, and I shall do this for Vestine." After putting them on, he said, I know nothing about binding on hell shoes if these loosen. The shoes are here for the journey to Valhalla, but the old name is retained. In Yorkshire, where we may see survivals of Teutonic custom, a pair of shoes given to a poor man in life would cause the giver after death to meet an old man who would present him with the same shoes at the edge of Winimur, a region full of thorns and firs, which otherwise the spirit would have to traverse with shoeless feet. This belief is illustrated by the Lyke-Wake Dirg, versions of which are still known in the north of England. Snorri limits hell to the old and those who died a straw death, that is, in bed. This is in keeping with the views which sent warriors to Valhalla, women to Freya, maidens to Gefjun, and the drowned to Ran. Behind these views is the more primitive one that all, even warriors, go to the underworld. The Eddic and Skaldic conception of Valhalla was mainly a product of the Viking Age, and slain warriors were even yet said to go to hell. Example: Balder, Hjalmgunnar, warriors mentioned in Atlamal, Sigurd, and others. Thor threatened to smite Halberd and Loki and send them to hell. Egil, after slaying 3 men, speaks of their faring to the high hall of hell. Regin and Fafnir went to hell, and Sigurd told Fafnir that a time comes when everyone must fare to hell. Fara til heljar. Though this phrase may be used here and elsewhere in the conventional sense of to die, still it points to what was once regarded as following death. The same conception is seen as late as the time of the Saxon Widukind of Corvey, who says that Gleeman declaimed after a victory, "Where is there an infernum so large as to hold such a multitude of the fallen?" Infernum stands here for the Saxon Hellia. So also in Saxo's story of Hadding's visit to the underworld, which has much in common with Norse conceptions, warriors are found there. Conversely, even some of those who did not die in battle went to Odin in Valhalla. Example: King Vanland, killed by a Mara, and King Halfdan, who died in bed. These are said to have gone to Odin, though Halfdan was bidden to go to him by Loki's daughter, that is, Hel. The dead in their barrows. With the early conception of hell as the general home of the dead, stands the equally early, if not earlier, conception of the dead living on in their barrows or burial mounds, as well as that of their being within hills. The barrow or group of barrows was in itself a small underworld. In primitive thought, this passed over to the conception of a hollow region under the earth or in the hill where the barrows were set, while yet the grave or barrow was thought to be the dead man's abode. Hell, the hollow place, was thus an extension of the barrow where the dead feasted, occupied themselves with the welfare of their kindred, and where their presence in these barrows was a blessing to the neighborhood. The dead were said to die into the hill, and this belief with its corollary that they still lived in grave, barrow, or hill is decidedly primitive. Dead Norsemen were vigorously alive in their barrows. The Erbugja saga tells how Thorstein's shepherd saw the hill of the north side of Helga fell open. Fires blazed in it. The clatter of ale horns was heard. Words of welcome were spoken to Thorstein and his companions, who had just been drowned at sea, and those already in the hill said that he would sit in the high seat with his father. A good example of the dead alive in their barrow is found in Helgi Hundingslangbana, though it is combined with the Valhall conception. A hill was raised for Helgi, and he went to Valhall. But at night, one of Sigrun's maidens saw him ride with many men to the hill. She told this to Sigrun, who went to see him and rejoiced at the reunion. Sigrun kissed him. His hair was covered with frost, his body damp with the dew of death. Helgi told her that her tears caused this dew, each tear falling like blood on his breast. Sorrow will now be forgotten. Now in the mound our brides we hold, the heroes' wives by their dead husbands, as if his followers were also visited by their living wives. Sigrun made ready a bed and said, I will make thee rest in my arms as once I did when you lived. So they rested until Helgi had to ride back to Valhall ere the cock woke the warrior throng there. Two beliefs are illustrated in this episode, besides that of the dead living in their barrow. That is, that excessive tears of mourners harm the dead, and that the dead can rejoin the living for a time, both widespread conceptions. Stories in the saga show that the forgotten dead in ancient barrows would reveal themselves to the living, that the dead resented any desecration of their barrows, and that they would make known to the living any annoyance caused them, example, by a thrall buried beside them. The Hervarar saga tells how Angantyr was buried with the famous sword Turfing, his 11 brothers being buried in as many mounds beside his own. His daughter Hervor, who had taken to Viking ways, visited the barrows in order to obtain the sword. She rode through the fire which burned around them, and by incantations forced her father to speak. In spite of his trying to send her away and telling her that the sword, lying beneath him surrounded by fire, would bring destruction with it, she still persisted, and now it came forth from the barrow of itself. Another story describes a visit paid by Thorstein to a barrow at the invitation of a dead man. In it were this man, Brynjar, and 11 men, besides other 11, companions of Ord. Brynjar and his men had to give treasure to Ord, but their store was running short. Thorstein, when asked by Ord for a gift, held out his axe, and when Ord would have taken it, he cut off his arm. A general fight between the two groups of the dead now began. Ord and his men were slain, and Brynjar gave Thorstein Ord's ring, which, laid beneath a dumb person's tongue, would make him speak. He also told Thorstein that he would change his fate, which they, the barrow folk, could not do, for they were earth dwellers or ghosts. The Njal saga tells how Gunnar's barrow was seen open with lights burning in it, and how he recited lines in an audible voice. His face was joyous. Yet immediately after, his son Hogni, who had witnessed this, speaks of Gunnar's going to Valhall. The barrow dweller, the Haugbui, or barrow wight, was sometimes troublesome to the living, as many stories in the sagas show. Grettir saw a fire in the barrow of Kar, who haunted the region near. He broke open the barrow and was removing its treasure when Kar attacked him. After a struggle, Grettir cut off Kar's head and placed it at his thigh, a recognized way of laying such substantial ghosts. Another story in the Grettir saga relates to the godless Glam, who was slain by a spirit, and now began to haunt the farm on which he had been a shepherd, riding on the roofs and nearly breaking them in. The hauntings continued for 2 winters. People who saw Glam went mad. Others were killed. Cattle were destroyed. Farms were burned. After a terrific fight, Grettir slew Glam, cutting off his head and placing it at his thigh. The body was then burned and the ashes buried deep. In other stories, such substantial ghosts do immense harm, and even after their bodies have been burned, their vitality continues through the ashes. Thus, a cow licked a stone on which the ashes of the vicious ghost of Thorolf had lain, and its calf continued the harm done by the ghost. Sometimes holy water and the saying of Mass, as well as a doom pronounced against the tormenting dead, were necessary before their haunting ceased. While the ghost haunted, its body was undecayed. These animated corpses, for they can hardly be called ghosts, resemble vampires, for the quelling of which similar rites of riddance were observed: cutting off the head, impaling, burning, and scattering the ashes. Many stories describe fights with the barrow wight by a hero bold enough to invade the barrow and try to remove the treasure contained in it. Saxo gives such a story. Asmund and Asvitus had promised to die with each other. Asvitus died first, and Asmund was buried alive with him. Soon after, the barrow was broken open, and Asmund came forth, ghastly and bleeding, for Asvitus has eaten its horse and dog and then attacked his friend, who, however, had been able to cut off his head and impale his body with a stake. All the dead did not act in these ways. They were helpful and interested in their descendants, and would appear to give information on different matters. Hence, some cult was paid to the dead at their barrows or at the natural hillocks into which they were supposed to have died. The greater or more beloved they were, so much the more reverence was shown them. Jordanes says of the Goths that they regarded dead chiefs as ansis or semideus. Adam of Bremen speaks of the cult of dead men who had performed mighty deeds, and cites the Vita saint Ansgari, which shows how the Swedes had neglected the gods through the coming of Christianity. Through a certain man they complained of this, and said that if the Swedes desired more gods, they might worship their former king Eirik, who would now become one of the gods. A temple was therefore erected in his honor, and sacrifices offered to him. The Indiculus Superstitionum shows that the dead were regarded as holy and worshipful. The sagas give several examples of the worship of popular or great persons when dead, and of the sacrifices paid to them. The euhemerized accounts of the gods also show how they, as supposed mortals, were deified and worshipped after their deaths. In Iceland, hillocks or hills were believed to be abodes of the dead, especially one near the family dwelling, on which we may suppose the barrows to have been made. The family barrow or barrows were usually beside the dwelling. The living believed that they would die into the hill. One of the early settlers in Iceland, Thorolf, in reverence for the hill on the ness to which his high-seat pillars had floated, and which was near his homestead, called it Helgafell, or Holy Fell. He would allow no one to pray to it unwashed. It must not be defiled, and no living thing could be destroyed on it or brought from it to die. Things and dooms were held on it, and Thorolf believed that he would die into it. On one occasion, as we have seen, it was found open and the dead were present in it. Another example is that of the place where the Lady Aud was buried, one of several hillocks on which she had raised crosses. Her kinsmen, falling into heathenism, made it a place of worship and sacrifice, and believed that they had died into these hills. Ari, the earliest chronicler, says that Sel Thorir and his kinsmen died into Thorir's hill. The memory toast was one drunk to kinsmen in their barrows. The Erfi or Erfiol was a feast in honor of the dead. Example, the head of a house, at which many guests were present, and much ale drunk in memory and honor of the departed. The heir then occupied the high seat for the first time. These funeral feasts for the dead are also described by Saxo. The sacrifices at Aud's Hill were for her benefit, and the dead were said to be present even visibly at their own funeral feasts. Evidence of this cult of the dead is seen in the denunciations of the Church through canons of synods and councils in the Teutonic area, as elsewhere. The dead were also inquired of at their mounds regarding the future, as Odin did regarding Balder, and Svipdag of his mother Groa. In Harbard's Ljod, Harbard says that he had learned the words spoken to Thor from the old men who dwell in the grave hills of home, that is, ancestral grave hills. Thor replies that he is giving a fine name to cairns when he describes them thus. Cairns, as distinct from barrows, were piled over criminals. What Harbard had learned had been communicated by wicked spirits. A shepherd slept on a mound in hope of composing a dirge in honor of its occupant Thorleif, but could get no further than, "Here lies a skald." One night the mound opened, and a stately man emerged, who told the shepherd that if he could remember a poem of 8 lines which he would recite to him, he would become a poet. On awaking, he recalled the lines and became a famous skald. Saxo tells how the giantess Hardgrep, desiring to know the future, made Hadding place a wooden slip engraved with runes beneath a dead man's tongue. He then uttered the prophecy. Odin knew a spell which would make a hanged man talk. Perhaps the Valgaldr, by which he awakened the dead seeress in Baldur's Draumr. There is no example in the Eddas of the dead appearing in dreams to the living to warn them or to foretell the future. In Atlamal, dead women were seen in a dream by Glaumvor, seeking and calling her husband Gunnar to come quickly to their benches. They were apparently his kinsfolk, desiring his presence in the other world. The belief that the dead communicated with the living through dreams was a common one, and Saxo gives an example of it. Hadding's dead wife prepared to him foretelling his death by his daughter's instigation, and now forewarned, he was able to prevent this. The dead ancestor was sometimes thought to dwell in a particular stone. In the Kristne saga, Kodran and his kin are said to have worshipped at a stone in which their ancestor dwelt. He told Kodran the future and of what he should beware. A bishop sprinkled the stone with holy water, and the ancestor complained to Kodran that he and his children were being driven from their home by hot water. After a second sprinkling he appeared, dark and evil of face, beseeching Kodran to drive away the bishop. After a third sprinkling, his appearance was lamentable. Kodran told him that he had worshipped him as a strong god, but, as he had proved false and weak, he would now become a Christian. A stone at which Thorsten worshipped and from which a voice was heard foretelling his death was probably also a spirit stone. In spite of the power of the Barrow-wight, men still sought in burial mounds for treasure, and curses against such persons are known on gravestones. With the coming of Christianity, the Barrow-wight became more or less demoniac, and later stories of encounters of living and dead are of a darker kind. All this belief of the dead living in their graves, barrows, or hills, or in stones, may seem to conflict with the belief in hell, still more with that in the heavenly Valhalla. But all regions and mythologies show how apparently contradictory beliefs can be held concurrently. Valhalla. The belief in hell is as prominent as the Valhall belief in the poetic Edda. Snorri and the Skalds give it more emphasis, and it was a profound future hope to warriors in the Viking Age, giving them courage in conflict and confidence that if slain, Odin would receive them. Valhall, or the Hall of the Slain, Vrops, or Odin's battle hall, stands gold bright and wide in Gladsheim, or abode of joy, a heavenly place. It is Odin's favorite abode. Spears are its rafters, shields its roof, its benches are strewn with corslets. A wolf hangs by its western door. Over it hovers an eagle, perhaps carved figures above the door. The cook Andhrimnir cooks the boar Sæhrimnir in the cauldron Eldhrimnir as food for dead warriors, though few know on what they feast. Odin's wolf sit beside him. The river Thund surrounds Valhall, and in it joyously swims Thjodvitnir's fish, the sun. The fallen find it hard to wade through the stream. Valgrind is the outer gate of Valhall, and behind it are 540 doors in the wall. Through each door, 800 warriors will go to fight the Fenris wolf at the doom of the gods. There is unfailing mead for the heroes, to whom the Valkyries bring it. Each day the warriors, or Einherjar, go forth to fight, felling each other, but they are magically healed by nightfall, when they feast. They are waked each morning by the cock Golinkambi, or gold comb. Some of these details from Grimnismal and Vafthrudnismal require explanation. The river Thund may be the sky in which the sun, the fish to be swallowed by the mighty wolf, or Thjodvitnir, runs its course, or perhaps it's the ocean surrounding Midgard, in which is the Midgard serpent. The three names, Andhrimnir, or sooty face, Eldhrimnir, or sooty with fire, and Sæhrimnir, or the blackened, are believed by R. M. Mayer to be formulae of a riddle. Sooty face seeds the blackened in sooty with fire. The answer being, the cook in Valhall seeds the boar in a cauldron. Snorri repeats this description of Valhall with additions. The host of Einherjar in Valhall will not be too great in the day of the gods' need. The boar's flesh suffices for all, and though killed and eaten, he is alive again each evening. Something better than water is given to the warriors who have bought their place in Valhall so dearly. From the udders of the goat Heidrun flows mead enough to fill a tun daily, and all the Einherjar could become drunk from it. When Gylfi or Gangleri arrived in Asgard, he saw a hall with many people, gaming, drinking, or fighting. This was evidently Valhall. Snorri also says that in Valhall swords were used instead of fire, just as gold gave light in Aegir's hall. Odin appoints dead warriors to Valhall and Vingolf, not mentioned in the poems. Elsewhere in Snorri, Vingolf is the abode of goddesses, close by Gladsheim. Warriors may have shared in this abode of goddesses, for Freya is said to decree who shall have seats in her hall, Sesrumnir in Folkvang. She chooses half of the dead, Odin the other. Sesrumnir may be the equivalent of Vingolf, the meaning of which is variously given as Friend Hall, Wine Hall, and Hall of the Beloved, where Valkyries serve the warriors. In the lexicon Mythologicum, the dying Hadding's words are given. He speaks of the Valkyries coming to him and says that he will go to Vingolf and drink beer with the Einherjar. The Einherjar were outstanding warriors, fallen in fight and chosen for Valhalla by the Valkyries. They were Odin's Osksynir, or wish sons, or adopted sons, and Odin himself was Valfather, father of the slain. They are assembled in Valhalla partly to aid the gods in the day of need, when they will ride forth with them to battle, though it is not known when the grey wolf, the Fenris wolf, will come, and many as they are, their number will seem small enough in that time. While it is true that all warriors did not go to Valhalla, and some went there who were not warriors, the view of the skalds was that it was exclusively for brave and noble fighters, men of high birth, heroes, free men. This is reflected in one of Björka's songs in Saxo. The poet says, "No humble and obscure race, no low-born ones, no base souls are Pluto's prey, but he weaves the fate of the mighty and fills Phlegethon with noble shapes." Pluto stands for Odin, Phlegethon for Valhalla. So, in Harbard's Ljod, the noble who fall in battle are set to go to Odin, while Thor has the thralls. Yet Thor himself is called Einherjar in Lokasenna. In the Eiriksmal and Hakonarmal, 10th century, already cited, we have seen how the Valkyries were sent forth to bring the heroes to Valhalla. In the former, Sigmund and Sinfjotli are bidden by Odin to go out and welcome Eirik and those who follow him. In the latter, Hermod and Bragi are sent to greet Hakon. Sigmund asked why Odin looked so much for Eirik's coming, and was told that he was such a mighty warrior. He died in fight because the gods needed such as he against the day of the wolf's coming. Hakon said that he mistrusted Odin because he had been slain, but Bragi told him that now the Einherjar will toast him and he will drink ale with the gods. The Valhalla belief had entered deeply into the Viking mind, as is seen in the phrase used of a hero falling in combat with another, to show him the way to Valhalla. Such heroes would wish each other a journey to Valhalla before fighting. When a warrior was buried, he was dedicated to Valhalla in the funeral oration. How did the conception of the heavenly Valhalla arise in Scandinavia? As Odin was father of the slain, lord of the Einherjar, and lord of ghosts, Drauga Drottin, so he had once been god of the dead in general. When he came to be regarded as dwelling in the sky, the abode of the dead, or, at least, of those more directly associated with him, was also transferred there. Valhalla in heaven was thus an extension of the underworld, or of an abode of warriors within a hill. Valhalla, with its surrounding stream, wall, gate and doors, and its hall, is a replica of hell. We have seen that the dead were supposed to go into hills regarded as sacred. Now certain hills in Scandinavia are called Hills of the Dead, Dodeberg, Dodemansbjörg, and some Icelandic and Swedish hills bear the name Valhalla. Odin was connected with hills which bear his name in Germany and Scandinavia, like Sigturs Mountain in Atlakvita. He was the man of the mountain and the god of the fells, Fjallgautr. Were these hollow hills into which the dead entered? With some such hills the wild hunt was linked, emerging from them and returning to them, and the dead took part in the hunt. The numerous legends of kings or heroes sleeping in hills with their followers are also in point here. The king or hero is an earlier deity, Wodan or some other. Charlemagne's army fought a battle at the foot of the Odenberg in Hesse. At night the hill opened, king and soldiers entered, and then it closed upon them. Every 7 or every 100 years they come forth in battle array, and after a time re-enter the hill. Other legends of armed men coming out of hills, fighting, and re-entering them are known from medieval times. The continual fighting of dead warriors, not in Valhalla, is an early belief enshrined in folk tradition. It is exemplified in the story of the Yadning strife in its various forms. Snorri gives one version of this and connects it with Hoi in Orkney. The kings Hogni and Hedin fought because Hodin had carried off Hild, Hogni's daughter. They and their men fought all day, and at night Hild resuscitated the dead. They renewed the fight next day, and all who fell turned to stone. But they rose up armed in the morning and fought again. In songs it is said that the Yadnings will fight thus till the doom of the gods. This continual fight is also mentioned in Bragi's poem, Ragnar's Drapa, 9th century. The story is also attached to the Brisinga men myth, Freya receiving back the necklace on condition that she should cause 2 kings and their armies to fight until a Christian ended the strife. The resuscitation theme occurs here also, and the fight continues for 143 years until one of Olaf Tryggvason's men agrees to kill all the warriors and so release them from their doom. Another version of the story is given briefly by Saxo. Hilda is said to have longed so ardently for Hedin that after he and Hogni had slain each other, she resuscitated them by her spells in order to renew the fight. Other legends deal with a similar theme, and Saxo, in one of his stories of a visit to the underworld, shows us dead warriors fighting there. Valhalla might thus be regarded as an underworld abode of warriors transferred to heaven as a result of Odin's growing importance in the Viking Age. The warriors there awaited the final assault of demoniac powers. Meanwhile, they fought, feasted, and caroused, as the dead feasted in Helgafell. It is also significant that Valhalla is the name applied to the hall where Atli and his warriors drank wine. Apparently, fighting as an occupation after death was not a primitive belief, for the earliest tombs do not contain armor and weapons. Whatever the origin of the Valhalla may be, but was not the only conception of otherworld life entertained by the Northmen. It is quite possible that in earlier times the state of the dead was not definitely formulated in Teutonic belief. In later times, different beliefs arose, and some of these were held simultaneously. The dead active in their barrows are also linked with Valhalla, as the Helgi poem and the reference to Gunnar in the Njal saga show. So also, according to Theodulf the Skald, Halfdan, who died in his bed, was bidden to the Thing of Odin, of Valhalla, by Vedrung's maiden, that is, Hel, for Vedrung is Loki. In the Helgi poem, as Niedner puts it, the Valhalla belief has been superimposed on an older tradition of hell, or of the dead living in their barrows. Retribution after death. The belief in the punishment of certain crimes after death is found among savage and barbaric peoples, and may quite well have been held by the Teutons. It is indeed spoken of in the Eddas, but the question of Christian influence has to be considered. Snorri speaks of the future Lord as dependent on the nature of the death, a common and primitive conception. Warriors went to Valhalla, those dying of sickness or old age to Hel, the drowned to Ran, etc. But he also says that All-Father gave man a spirit which is immortal. All men shall live, the righteous with him in Gimle, evil men in Hell, and thence to Niflhel, in the 9th world. This contradicts the other passage, and suggests that Hell is an evil place. In the third passage, already cited, Snorri makes hell a place of cold, famine, and disease. Christian ideas seem to have obtruded themselves, that of man's immortal soul, of the righteous in Gimle or heaven, of the wicked in hell and Niflhel. Snorri seems to have been in error in making hell and Niflhel different places. Elsewhere, Niflhel is equivalent to hell, and the earlier sources, example, the Eddic poems, do not suggest that hell is an evil place of misery. These passages tell of man's fate after death, but Snorri also describes the places allotted to men at the renewal of the world. There will be many good and many evil abodes. Best will it be to exist in Gimle, where will be abundance of drink for those who like it in the hall called Brimir, which is in Okolnir. A good hall is that which stands in Nidafels, made of red gold, and called Sindri. In these the good and pure in heart shall dwell. Gimle is further described as fairest of all halls, brighter than the sun, and the south end of heaven. When heaven and earth have departed, it shall continue, and the good shall dwell in it. It is believed to be in the third heaven, Vidblaim, and so invulnerable against the fires of Surth. On Nastrand, or Korpstrand, is a great and evil hall, its doors facing north. All the snakeheads turn into it and spurt venom, so that it runs in 2 rivers along the hall. Perjurers and murderers wade these rivers. In Vergelmir it is worse, for there the cursed snake tears dead men's corpses. In this account there seems to be a mingling of pagan and Christian beliefs, and some misunderstanding of his sources by Snorri. In Voluspa, Gimle is a hill on which the hall stands. A hall I saw, fairer than the sun, decked with gold on Gimle's heights. There shall dwell true hosts, and enjoy happiness never to end. Even this stanza is suspect of Christian influence. In Voluspa, also Brimir's hall has no connection with the Lord of the Righteous Dead, while Sindri is the name of a dwarf, not of a hall. In the north stood on Nidafels a hall of gold for Sindri's people. On Okolnir another hall stood, the beer hall of the giant Brimir. Sindri's people are dwarves. The next stanzas describe a place of punishment, which Snorri connects with life after the doom of the gods. But, unless their position in Voluspa is misplaced, this must be a present place of punishment, not one in the renewed world. A hall I saw stand far from the sun. On Nastrand, its doors facing the north, venom streams down from the smoke hole, for serpents are winding round the walls. There I saw wading through rivers wild, oath breakers and murderers, and such as entice other men's wives. There sucked Nidhogg the dead, and the wolf tore men. The composition of this second verse is doubtful. Line 3 may be interpolated. Lines 4 and 5 may belong to a stanza with no reference to punishments for sin after death. According to Grimnismal, the dragon Nidhogg gnaws the root of Yggdrasil. Snorri says that the dragon gnaws that root which is over Niflheim, and below which is Vergelmir, a well in hell. In the concluding stanza of Voluspa, possibly also interpolated or out of its proper place, the dragon Nidhogg comes flying from Nidafels, bearing the bodies of men on his wings. That perjurers, murderers, and adulterers were punished after death would be in keeping with Teutonic ideas of the enormity of these crimes, and the punishments meted out in life for committing them. In Sigurd Rifumal, an evil fate is said to await the perjurer, and in Reginsmal, Andvari says that perjurers will suffer long waiting through Vagdelmir's waters. This river, not many Chapter 33 Cosmogony and the Doom of the Gods. The Eddic picture of the origin of the universe goes back to a time when neither gods nor men, heaven nor earth, existed. There was a great abyss, Ginnunga Gap, or yawning chasm, a conception probably due to popular belief in an abyss outside the ocean surrounding the earth. North of it had been made by Niflheim, a frost and mist region, within which was the well Vergelmir, a cauldron rushing, from which flowed several rivers. To the south was Muspel, light and glowing, ruled over by Surth. The streams, or Elivagar, from Niflheim, as they flowed, became ice, which spread into Ginnunga Gap. There the ice met warm airs from Muspel, or Muspelheim, and began to melt. Life was quickened in this by the power of that which sent the heat, and took form as a giant Ymir. From him came the frost giants. From the dripping rime there sprang the cow Audhumla, explained as the rich polled cow, Audr, riches, that is, its milk, and humla, polled. Streams of milk from its udders nourished Ymir, and the cow was nourished by licking the salty ice blocks. As she licked there came forth from the ice Buri, who was father of Bor. Bor married Bestla, a daughter of the giant race. They had 3 sons, Odin, Vili, and Ve. Thus the giant race preceded the gods, as Saxo also indicates, and gods and giants were opposed to each other. The sons of Bor slew Ymir, and his blood drowned all the frost giants, save Bergelmir, with his wife and household. The 3 brothers bore Ymir's body into Ginnunga Gap, and made of it the earth. Sea and waters came from his blood, gravel and stones from his teeth, and such bones as were broken, rocks from his bones. The sea was placed as a ring round the earth. His skull became the sky, set up over the earth and upheld by 4 dwarves. The earth is ring-shaped, and on its coasts the gods gave lands to the giants. Within the earth they erected the wall against the giants, made of Ymir's eyebrows. This they called Midgard. Of Ymir's brain, thrown into the air, they made the clouds. The glowing embers and sparks from Muspelheim were set in the heaven, above and beneath, to illumine heaven and earth. The gods assigned places to all, even to such as were wandering free. This is Snorri's account, based partly on sources now lost, partly on stanzas of Voluspa, Grimnismal, and Vafthrudnismal. Voluspa says, "In time's morning lived Ymir. Then was no sand, sea, nor cool waves. No earth was there, nor heaven above, only a yawning chasm, nor grass anywhere. Then Bor's sons upheaved the earth, and shaped the beautiful Midgard. From the south the sun shone on earth's stones, and from the ground sprang green leeks." The first verse seems to contain the myth of Ymir formed in Ginnunga Gap. The second gives a myth of earth raised out of an existing ocean, not made from Ymir's flesh. The sun shone on it, and growth began. Whether both verses came from one hand, or, as Boyer holds, the second alone belongs to an earlier form of the poem, is immaterial. The myth of earth raised out of ocean is found in other mythologies. The next verses tell how sun, moon, and stars were allotted their places, and how the gods gave names to night, new, and full moon, etc. And Vafthrudnismal, the giant, in response to Odin's question, tells how earth and sky arose, but does not speak of them as a work of the gods. Out of Ymir's flesh was shaped the earth, the mountains out of his bones, the heaven from the ice-cold giant skull, out of his blood the boisterous sea. This is succeeded by an account of the giants, the first of whom is said to have been made out of the venom from Elivagar. No mention is made of fire and heat, only of frost and ice. Grimnismal speaks of the origin of earth from Ymir's flesh, ocean from his blood, heaven from his skull, the hills from his bones, and it adds that trees were formed from his hair, Midgard from his eyebrows, made by the gods for men, and out of his brain the clouds. In Voluspa, 3 gods lift earth out of ocean, but the other poems merely mention gods, without specifying the number or saying how they came into existence. Snorri says that from Odin and Frigg came the kindred known as the Aesir, a divine race. In an earlier passage, he speaks of All-Father, or Odin, living through all ages and fashioning heaven, earth, and all things in them. The latter is probably a reflection from Christian views of creation. The conception underlying Snorri's main account is that giants, gods, and all things may be traced back to the union of water and fire. The ice contains salt, and this plays an important part in the myth of Authumla. An interesting comparison is found in Tacitus, who, speaking of the sacred salt springs near the Sale, says that the waters were made to evaporate on red-hot coals, and salt was thus obtained from 2 opposite elements, fire and water. This may point to an old Germanic cosmogonic myth with fire, water, and salt as elements. Skaldic kennings illustrate the Eddic myth of Ymir. Heaven is skull of Ymir, or burden of the dwarves. Earth is flesh of Ymir. The sea is blood of Ymir. The hills are Ymir's bones. Grimm cites passages from medieval ecclesiastical documents dating from the 10th century onwards, in which man is said to have been created out of different materials. One of these says that Adam's bones were made from stone, his flesh from earth, his blood from water, his heart from wind, his thought from clouds, his sweat from dew, his hair from grass, his eyes from the sun. The 4 documents differ in details, but there is a curious inverse parallel with the Eddic account, which uses the microcosm as material for the macrocosm, and in other inversely makes the universe contribute to the formation of man. Voluspa goes on to tell that the gods met at Ithavol in the midst of Asgard and built temples and altars, made forges to work gold, wrought tongs and fashioned tools. This was during their golden age. Then the creation of dwarfs is described. Snorri amplifies this. All-Father gave counsel about the town in the midst of Ithaval. A temple was made with 12 seats and a 13th for All-Father. It is all of gold and is called Gladsheim. A second house was built for the goddesses, called Vingolf. Houses were made for workshops, and tools, anvils, hammers, and tongs were fashioned. The Aesi worked in metals, stone, and wood, and fashioned their household wares of gold. Hence that time is called the Age of Gold. Then follows the creation of the dwarves. Voluspa next gives the myth of human origins. Odin, or Hoenir, and Lodur came forth to the land and found Ask and Embla, ash and elm, unprovided with faith and without strength, soul, breath, movement, heat, or colour. Odin gave them soul, Hoenir sense, Lodur heat and goodly colour. Snorri says that Odin, Vili, and Ve, walking on the shore, found 2 trees, which they shaped into human beings. Odin gave them soul, Vili life, Ve hearing and sight. They named the male Ask and the female Embla, and of them mankind was begotten. In an earlier passage, where biblical influence may be seen, Snorri says that All-Father made man, giving him spirit which shall never die, though the flesh frame rot or burn to ashes. The shaping of human beings out of trees may have been suggested by wooden images, such as those which the speaker in Havamal says that he found and on which he put clothes. Now they regarded themselves as champions. Such images, called Thremadr, are mentioned in other documents. In Rigstilla, the different classes of men were begotten by Rig. The account given by Tacitus on the founders of the Germanic race is interesting by way of comparison. The Germans celebrate in ancient hymns a god, Thuisto, issued from the earth, and his son Mannus as the originators of their race. Mannus had 3 sons, progenitors of the Ingvaiones, Herminones, and Istaivones. Some, however, think that the god had other sons, progenitors of other tribes. Mannus is thus the first man, born of a god who comes out of the earth, perhaps regarded as spouse of a heaven god. His sons were eponymous ancestors of 3 chief German groups. If Thuisto was thought to be produced by earth alone, and himself also produced sons, he would resemble Ymir, who also begat giants without a female. Separate cosmogonic myths occur here and there. A river, Van, is formed from the slaver out of the mouth of the Fenris wolf. Stars were made of the eyes of Thjazi and Aurvandil's toe. A well from the footprint of Baldur's horse, etc. For the Eddic conception of the universe, we begin with the earth, the middle of things, a general Teutonic conception. Gothic Midjungards, or Middelgard, or Middangeard, Mittigard, Midgard, or literally boundary wall, that is, the mountains by which the giants were shut out from the habitable earth, then the earth as the dwelling place of man, or, as Snorri conceived it, a citadel. Thor is Midgard's warder, Veor, against the giants. Earth is a vast disk, surrounded by the ocean or floating upon it, and in this ocean is the Midgard serpent, lying about the land and surrounding it, his tail in his mouth, the girdle of all lands. Around the shores of earth are mountains, rocks, wastes, and caves, and these are the dwellings of giants, Jotunheim or Utgard, though Utgard was also regarded as being beyond the ocean. According to one passage of Snorri, Asgard, the abode of the gods, is a city which men call Troy, in the midst of Midgard. It is the new Asgard, in place of the elder Asgard in Asia. This conception of Asgard is due to Snorri's euhemerism and the desire to connect the Scandinavian people and deities with ancient Greece. The earlier pagan view of Asgard made it a heavenly abode, or possibly it was on the top of a lofty central mountain, which would give a link with Snorri's view of Asgard on earth. Above all was heaven, overacting and resting on earth. Between heaven and earth was the bridge Bifrost or Bilrost, which the gods had made, the Asbru or Bridge of the Aesir. It is the rainbow of 3 colors. It is very strong and made with greater craft than any other structure. The red color is fire, which keeps the hill giants off. Over this best of bridges, the gods ride daily to their tribunal at Urdswell. Another name of the bridge is Vindhyalsambru, or the Wind Helmet's Bridge. At the doom of the gods, the sons of Muspel will cross it and break down. Meanwhile, Heimdall is its guardian. Valhall is Odin's hall in Asgard, where are also Gladsheim and Vingolf, but Grimnismal places Valhall in Gladsheim, the place of joy. Separate dwellings of gods and others are enumerated in Grimnismal and by Snorri, and these appear mainly to be in heaven. The chief of them are Alfheim, abode of the Alfar and Frey, Breidablik, Baldur's abode, Valaskjalf, seat of the fallen, possessed by Odin and thatched with silver. In it is Hilskjalf, gate seat, whence Odin surveys all worlds. Valaskjalf may be Valhall. Thrudvangnir, with its hall Bilsknirnir, is Thor's abode. Much speculation has been indulged in regarding the 9 worlds spoken of in Voluspa and Vafthrudnismal, as well as in an interpolated stanza in Alvismal, where the dwarf says, Oft have I fared in the 9 worlds all, and wide is my wisdom in each. In Voluspa, the Volva says that she knows 9 worlds, 9 rooms of the mighty world tree. The giant in Vafthrudnismal says that he has been in every world, the 9 worlds, even to Niflheim. In all 3 passages, the idea is that of comprehensive knowledge on the parts of the speaker: dwarf, seeress, giant. This knowledge is possessed by different kinds of beings dwelling in different regions. Alvis knows the names given to various things by several orders of beings dwelling in earth, heaven, Alfheim, etc. 9 worlds would thus be more a figurative phrase than one expressing local geography or cosmology. In Voluspa, these worlds are connected with the world tree, itself a comprehensive symbol. Regarded as different regions, the 9 worlds may be 1. Asgard, 2. Vanaheim, 3. Alfheim, though this is one of the dwellings in heaven, 4. Midgard, 5. Jotunheim, 6. Muspelheim, 7. Svartalfheim, 8. Hel or Niflhel. The 9th is uncertain. It may be obtained by dividing Hel from Niflhel, or, preferably, by including a water world. Undoubtedly, the numbering of 9 worlds is connected with the sacredness and importance of the number 9 in religion, myth, folk belief, and poetry. Below Midgard is Svartalfheim, the region of the dwarves. Hel or Niflhel is also a subterranean abode. While Snorri speaks of Niflhel in this sense, he also speaks in error of Niflheim, apparently another form of the name, as a region in the north, the cold region of mist, where streams flowed into Ginnungagap. In Niflheim, Snorri places the well Verglelmir, whence spring certain rivers, among them Yol, which is near Helgates. It is under the roof of Yggdrasil, which stands over Niflheim. In Grimnismal, the site of Vergelmirs is not given, but it is said that from the horns of the hart which eats the branches of Laerad, a stream drips into Vergelmir, and thence all the rivers run.